Where the Left Goes Wrong. This will be a non-ideological look at the problems of the left, and especially progressive politics. I considered myself to be extremely progressive. Unfortunately, however, progressives rarely call out problems within their own worldview because they're too busy fighting with the right, with neoliberals, with centrists, with fascists, with racists, and so on. And even deeper than that, it's not just that they're so busy fighting, it's that they don't actually have enough perspective. They don't have enough distance from their own worldview. They haven't self-reflected enough. They're not honest enough with themselves to see the problems that exist on the left and within progressive circles. So that's what this episode will be tackling. It's very important, I feel, that progressives call out problems on their own side, because this is how we can evolve to spiral dynamic stage turquoise or tier 2 politics, which I've discussed before in my spiral dynamic series. Go check out my spiral dynamic series if you don't know what these colors like yellow and orange and blue mean, which I'll be using. And also check out my other episode series called Conscious Politics, Part 1, 2, 3, 4, where I talk about this stuff a lot. Now, I've been pretty politically lately in the last 5 years in my content and my videos, and that's because a lot of shenanigans have been going on, and a lot of people have been really badly misusing ideology and groupthink in our culture. And so part of my work is to help correct that. And I get a lot of shit for criticizing the right. And the right, especially in America, deserves a lot of criticism. So it's right that I've been criticizing the right. However, when I do that, people accuse me of bias and partisanship. But of course, I'm actually very unbiased and very nonpartisan. And so in an effort to balance things out, now here, we're going to be focusing on the left. Of course, the left has its problems. This is not something new to me. This is not some new awakening I've had just recently. I've always seen the problems of the left, but I especially see it more now because I've spent the last 7 years or so, basically ever since Trump started running for office, really deeply studying both the left wing and the right wing in American politics, and also that led me into studying world politics. So I've been studying this a lot now, and I have a lot of frankly, criticisms and things that I've observed as oversights on the left. So I've kind of gathered them all here together into this one episode. Now, it's been said that it's easy to tell when the right wing goes too far, but it's harder to tell when the left wing goes too far, which actually makes the left wing more dangerous. And there is some truth to this statement. The dangers of the right wing are pretty obvious. Although not obvious enough, apparently, for like 40 or 50% of the population, the dangers of the right wing are not obvious, which is why they need to be talked about, which is why I've talked about them a lot in the past. If the dangers of the right wing were so obvious, then we wouldn't have Trump. We wouldn't have MAGA. We wouldn't have all these right-wing nationalist, quasi-fascist, racist, homophobic, and so on political movements, xenophobic, anti-immigrant movements happening all around the world. It's not just in America, all around the world, in Europe and South America and elsewhere. So clearly it's not so obvious. However, for those of us who are a little bit more developed and a little bit more intelligent, and to those of us who to whom that is obvious, you say, okay, yeah, that's obvious, but what about, the problems on the left? Surely there must be problems on the left. And of course, there are problems on the left. But notice this as well, that if you think that the problems on the right are more obvious than the problems on the left, why is that? That's actually goes to buttress the point that I've been making for a long time, is that there's an asymmetry between the development levels of the left and the right. They're not equally developed. The right wing is less developed than the left wing. Now, when I say that, again, people think I'm being biased or partisan because I just favor the left. No, that's not the reason. If you do an objective analysis and you do a study of the actual development stages of the ego, which we've looked at in the Spiral Dynamics series and also in my series called The 9 Stages of Ego Development, the Susan Cook-Greuter model. Go check out that series of episodes as well. This is all within the realm of developmental psychology. If you actually look at developmental psychology, what you'll see there is that the human mind evolves and develops. It develops through various kinds of stages. These stages are pretty consistent around the world. They've been very well researched and tracked, and we can predict where your mind is going to develop cognitively, morally, spiritually, in terms of how you view men and women, how you view morality and various kinds of political rights. These things evolve in a very predictable manner. And you're not as original of a thinker as you think you are. Most people, when they're doing politics, they're just parroting ideas. They're parroting ideas at the very level of development that they happen to be at, whatever stage that is. So the right wing, especially in America, tends to be spiral dynamic stage blue/orange. And the left wing in America tends to be spiral dynamic stage orange/green and a little bit into yellow. These are generalizations. This isn't always true. Of course, you can find left-wingers who are less developed than right-wingers. Of course, that's the case. We're generalizing. Generally, though, that's the case. And of course, all these stages have problems. So when I say that the left is more developed than the right, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a lot more developed. That doesn't mean that there are no problems on the left. No, there's a lot of problems with your standard neoliberal or progressive who's roughly in spiral dynamic stage orange/green. If they're very, very progressive, they might be solid green, but there's still many problems with solid green, which I've talked about in my episode called Spiral Dynamic Stage Green. If you go watch that episode, you'll understand all of the problems with stage green. Yeah, there's problems with stage green. There's problems with stage orange. There's problems with stage blue. There's problems even with stage yellow. All these stages have their limitations, and so we just want to become aware of them. If you're on the left, ask yourself this: when does the left go too far? And if you cannot think of some good points on this question, that's a clue to you that you're fooling yourself and that you're lost in ideology. So the rest of this episode is me answering the question, when does the left go too far? Now, I'm not going to be bashing the right so much in this episode. So those of you who are lefties and progressives, you might, if this is the only political episode of mine that you watch, you're going to come away thinking that, oh my God, Leo is some crypto right-winger. Why is he supporting the right-wingers here? I'm not supporting the right-wingers here. I have a very balanced perspective on the right and the left. And I am part of the left. But in this episode, I'm only focusing on the problems of the left. I'm not going to be talking about any of the good redeeming qualities of the left, of which there are many. I'm not focusing on that at all. And I'm not going to be talking about any of the obvious problems on the right, all right? So you have to keep that in mind. So this episode might come off as it's very unbalanced. That's by design, because we're specifically answering the question, when does the left go too far? That's our challenge here. We're not looking at anything else. If you want a more broader perspective on my ideas about the right and the left, go check out those other episodes of mine that I've released. And I'll be doing more in the future that are more balanced. All right, so here are all the problems with progressive politics. Spiral dynamic stage green, basically. The first one is not taking immigration as a serious, legitimate issue. Progressives tend to treat immigration as though, like, well, if you're anti-immigration, if you have any concerns about immigration, if you want to tighten up the border in your country, then basically you're, at the very least, you're xenophobic, and probably you're racist and you're fascist, and that's all there is to it. That's not the case. There are legitimate concerns about immigration policy in any country. How many immigrants should we let in? What kind of immigrants should we let in? What kind of policy should we have in terms of how do we screen them? What are the security threats? This is not just problems that xenophobic and racist people have. Because you can always take it to the extreme. If you completely open the border of a country and you just let anybody in, willy-nilly, this is going to create chaos and problems for your country at some point. Now, It may be the case that America's a large country with over 300 million citizens. We can probably take in millions of immigrants and foreigners, many of them from very poor countries, very underdeveloped countries. But you have to admit, if you're a progressive or a liberal, you have to admit that at some point this is going to create problems. And there's multiple levels of problems this will create. Some progressives and socialist types tend to fool themselves into thinking like, well, ideally we should have open borders. Now this notion of open borders, a lot of right-wingers take it too far, and the majority of the left and even progressive politicians, nobody out there is really advocating for open borders. This would be like the most extreme position on the far, far, far left. If you find some sort of Marxist far left, college kids, they might fancy themselves so progressive that they just want open borders everywhere. Well, they're foolish. They don't understand that the borders are there for a reason. If you just let everybody in, this is going to create problems for you. It will create infrastructure problems. There might not be enough, immigration centers to process all the people. There might not be enough government facilities to process all the people. There might not be enough roads, not enough bridges, not enough pipelines, not enough housing, not enough schooling, right? So all these problems, the system will start to get strained. You have to admit this. It's just a question of when. Maybe you can take in 1 million people, but if you take in 5 million people, the system will start to get strained. And if you take in 10 million people, the whole system will just collapse. So there's that. That's one issue, but there's more than just that. The other issue is that you have to understand that the majority of citizens in any country are very nationalistic. They have a national identity. They consider themselves to be Americans or Mexicans or Russians or Jews or whatever. And that's their identity. That's how they see themselves. They also have a certain culture that they see as their mother culture. They have a mother language. They have a mother religion, and so on. And so what happens is that if you just allow one culture to get overwhelmed and inundated by another culture, another ethnic group, this is not just a matter of, oh, we don't like those smelly foreigners, xenophobia type of thing. No, there's deeper problems here because there is going to be a cultural dilution that goes on. The culture of the mother country into which the immigration is happening, that culture is going to get diluted and it's going to change. Now, you might say, well, but Leo, we should all be multicultural, and it doesn't matter, if American culture shifts, if a bunch of Spanish-speaking people move in here. It doesn't matter what language we speak. It doesn't matter what religion we have. It doesn't matter what skin color people are. It's racist to care about those things. You're not being subtle enough, and you're not being realistic enough about how nationalism actually works. These things actually do matter, and it's not just merely a matter of racism or purely xenophobia. Firstly, you have to understand that virtually all human beings are xenophobic by our nature, from evolution. We had to be this way because we're wired to be very tribal. We have an in-group, we have an out-group, and by our nature, we tend to hate and demonize the out-group and be afraid of the out-group. Now, if you doubt whether you're xenophobic or not, it's very easy to prove to yourself that you're xenophobic. And the way that you prove that to yourself is just this little thought experiment. If some aliens beamed you aboard a UFO, you would be terrified. Why are you terrified? Are you terrified because you're a racist? No. It's because you're naturally afraid of the unknown. When you don't know some group of people that you're going to be spending time with, that's scary. That's a legitimate fear. That's not just an irrational fear that, oh, you're a racist. No, you don't know what these aliens are going to do to you. Now you might say, well, Leo, but that might be true with aliens, but that's not true with Mexicans, or that's not true with Jews, or that's not true with black people. Actually, you don't know that. If you're a very cosmopolitan person who's traveled around the world and tasted different cuisines and studied different countries and been around a different kinds of people with different kinds of ethnicities, then you're very comfortable being around people who look different than you. and have different languages than you and eat different food than you and pray to a different God than you, you're comfortable. But it took you time to acclimate to that. And you still might not be totally comfortable. You still will have cultural preferences. You might prefer one culture over another culture simply because, not because you're racist or xenophobic, but simply because you have your preferences. We all have our preferences. You have a preference for what kind of cuisine is your favorite. You have a preference for what kind of languages you want to speak. And you have a preference for what kind of religious philosophies you prefer versus other ones. And which customs of doing business or getting married you prefer over other ones. See? And so do the majority of the people in your community. But the majority of the people in your community, you have to understand, this is what progressives don't understand because they have a blind spot here, is that they are not as multicultural and open as you are. They're not as experienced. And they are legitimately frightened by new religions, new cuisines, new languages, new customs, and different ways of living life. It creates a culture shock. It makes them feel uncomfortable. And at the very least, the only reason we should limit immigration is if none of the other problems are legitimate. If, let's say, our infrastructure can handle an infinite number of immigrants. What you should take seriously, though, is that the majority of the people and citizens of your community are not going to tolerate this rapid change in culture very well. This is going to literally frighten them. It's going to make them very uncomfortable. And you might say, well, Leo, so what? Those are racist and xenophobic people, and that's their problem. Again, you're being naive. It's not merely their problem. It's going to make, they are going to make it your problem. You see? Because they're not going to just sit by with all their fear and being uncomfortable with this flood of immigrants and this rapid changing in culture, in their religion and in their language and so forth and in their customs. They're not just going to sit by and tolerate this. This is going to piss them off, and they're going to go and they are going to start fascist movements as a reaction. And this is not some sort of hypothetical concern. This is a legitimate, very, very practical concern that you should be concerned with as a progressive. So as a progressive, even if you feel very comfortable with immigration and all this kind of stuff, you have to be very careful to understand that the majority of the citizens in your community are not as developed as you. They're not as open-minded as you. They're not as multicultural as you. And therefore, because when we're talking about politics, we're talking about what is going to work for the majority of people, not for the most developed 5% or 10%, for the majority of people. And the majority of people, you have to just be honest with yourself, they literally are racist and xenophobic. And they have pretty strong cultural preferences, and they're nationalistic. And now, there are problems with racism, of course, and we should try to limit it and so forth. But also you have to be realistic about how quickly you can change that. And a lot of times progressives are not realistic about this. And when you start to smear these people as racists and fascists and other kinds of names like this, this actually worsens the problem because you're not really understanding the depth of what's going on here. It's not your just standard old school style of racism, although sometimes it is. See, this is another problem here that I see with progressive politics, is when it comes to racism. This term is way overused. And really, you should start thinking about the problems of racism, not as racism, but more as ethnocentrism. What's the difference? And you have to be careful here because it might sound like, well, Leo, it seems like you're whitewashing these racists. Why don't we just call them racists because they're racists rather than calling it ethnocentrism, which seems like a less dirty word. But you see, the problem with the word racist is that it is such a dirty word that nobody is going to admit to themselves that they're racist. You might say, well, Leo, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that, look, if our goal is to minimize racism, we need to construct a set of systems and a pathway to get people who are racist towards being non-racists. And ironically, by calling everybody a racist and not having any leeway or sympathy for the place that they're at, it makes it impossible to then change them and get them to admit certain biases that they have, which otherwise they might admit. But as soon as you call them a racist, that's it. You shut down the whole conversation. So you end up in a counterproductive situation. But actually, there's something deeper here, which is that these days, now in the past, racism was a lot more prevalent. These days, I think the majority of people are not strictly racist, but they are deeply ethnocentric. What's the difference? Ethnocentric means that you're loyal and you have a deep preference for the culture that you grew up in, basically. That's what it means. You have a preference also for your ethnicity. And it's not just that you have a preference for your race per se, or that you think your race is superior to other races. So technically, the way that I would define racism is someone is a racist if they think that their race is superior to another race. I actually think that's pretty rare. The majority of people don't believe that anymore. Now, in the past, that used to be true. But just because you don't think your race is superior to other races, that doesn't mean that you're equally comfortable with all races, and also not just races, but the cultures that come with the races. You have to understand, right? So race and culture and ethnicity, these tend to be deeply connected. You may not be a racist, strictly speaking, but you may have pretty strong preferences for what culture, what customs, what language you're comfortable with, what religion you're comfortable with. And these all tend to come together as a group, you see. And so this is what a lot of progressives don't understand about the Trump supporters and MAGA and conservatives, is that most of these conservatives are not racists, but they are ethnocentric. And they do have a strong preference for their culture, and they want to preserve and defend their culture because they're in love with their culture. They don't want to see their culture diluted. And they're threatened by the idea of multiculturalism. Now you might say, well, Leo, but that's their problem, you know. That's because they're bigots. Why don't we call them bigots? They're just closed-minded to different kinds of cultures. And that's an ugly thing. And we should seek to change that at the political level. You might say that as a progressive. But here you have to really understand the depth of our problem. Multiculturalism doesn't just come naturally. This is something that has to be developed. It doesn't happen automatically. Open-mindedness does not happen automatically. In fact, the majority of the citizens in your country or community are extremely closed-minded. That's what we're dealing with here on a practical level. And you have to be sensitive to that and willing to accommodate that. You can't just dismiss that and think that everyone should be as open-minded as you. No. Actually, they can't be. And the reason they can't be is because they haven't had the life experience you've had. They haven't had the education opportunities that you've had. It's no secret that the majority of progressives and people who are very passionate about stage green politics, they come from universities. Many of them from elite universities. But you know what? The majority of the citizens in your community do not have the economic opportunities to even go to universities. Even the basic ones, never mind to Harvard and Yale and Stanford and this kind of stuff. The majority of Americans don't have a college degree. And even if they do, it's a sort of a low-level college degree. They probably didn't get very good grades. And they probably went to a university, to a small college, a small university, not a big one, that wasn't as ethnically diverse and culturally diverse as something like a Stanford or a Harvard. And many of them didn't go at all. You see. And so while you had the opportunities to go to these diverse universities and to learn about different cultures, and maybe your parents were wealthy enough to send you to travel around the world, maybe you spent a summer in Europe or in South America or in Asia. But think about what allowed you those opportunities. It was only because your parents had money. And it was also only because you were already open-minded enough, probably because if you're cosmopolitan and multicultural, probably your parents were as well. And their values rubbed off on you. So when your dad suggested that you spend a summer in Europe, that was already his multiculturalism influencing you. But see, that's not true for the majority of the people in your community. And so their minds were not open to different cultures. And so they are literally afraid of different cultures. They don't understand Islam. They don't understand Chinese culture. They don't understand, and they're literally frightened by the Spanish language. Yeah. That's how basic this is. And if you want to be a good politician and you want to do the best for your community, really, when we're talking about politics, what are we talking about? We're talking about developing our community, helping everybody or as many people as possible within our community to expand their consciousness and to grow and develop themselves, right? But you have to understand that human beings can only grow at a certain pace. And the biggest mistake that progressives make is that they assume that everybody in their community is willing and able to grow at the same pace that they themselves have grown at. And it's precisely because the progressives have grown faster and more than the majority of people in their community that now they're out of touch. And they don't understand the challenges that the rest of people, the more simple-minded people, the poorer people, progressives tend to underestimate the challenges that those people have in developing a sense of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism and tolerance and open-mindedness. What they further underestimate is that literally they've done biological studies on this, is that conservatives are literally born with brains that are wired in such a way that make them more closed-minded and more fearful. Just as a baseline, never mind what kind of parents they have, never mind if they grow up in a cosmopolitan city like New York or San Francisco, a city like that, or whether they grow up in a little town in the middle of Alabama, right? Never mind any of those factors. Just their baseline brain chemistry is such that they're more closed-minded. And therefore, they're more fearful of things that they haven't encountered yet, that they don't understand, right? So literally what I'm telling you is that if you take a liberal or a progressive with a very progressive mind and you beam him up into a UFO with some aliens, he will be less terrified. Now, he'll still probably be terrified, but he'll be less terrified than if you take a conservative and do the exact same thing. Just by the wiring of the brain chemistry. That's pretty amazing. And to not take that into account when you're doing politics is a gross oversight. And a lot of the misunderstanding between conservatives and liberals has to do with just this simple biological fact. But of course, on top of this, there's a lot of cultural, programming that goes into it as well. It very much matters whether you grow up in the countryside or whether you grow up in San Francisco. If you grew up in San Francisco, you're going to be way more cosmopolitan and multicultural and open-minded than if you grew up in a small 500-person town in Alabama. And that's exactly why you see that the way politics breaks down, if you look, come election time, when voting is happening, when the votes are being tabulated, you see which parts of the country are the red votes coming from and which are the blue coming from. And you can see that all the blue votes are coming from large cities. Even in very red states like Alabama, if you take a look at the biggest, most cosmopolitan city in Alabama, those are going to be a lot of blue votes. And conversely, if you take a look at California, which is like the most progressive state, you might say, if you take a look at the votes that are coming from the rural parts of California, they're all red states. I mean, they're all red votes. So really, this designation of red states and blue states is a very poor way of looking at it, because it's not the state that determines whether your votes are red or blue. It's really urban versus rural. And that's because when you live in an urban environment, you just by necessity are forced to confront people from different ethnicities, of different races, different cultures, from all around the world, speaking different languages, eating different foods, and you're all living in close proximity to each other. Whereas if you grew up in the middle of Alabama in a 500-person town, it's only going to be one kind of person, people like you for the most part. And when you grow up in that for 30 years, that's going to be like locked and cemented into your mind of what is normal. And then anything that you encounter outside of that is going to seem scary and uncomfortable. And this is not something that you can just fix about yourself. It's not like somebody who grew up for 30 years in the middle of Alabama in some rural part of town there can just flip some sort of switch because you tell him to. You know, you tell him, oh, stop being racist and just open your mind to multiculturalism. And then he says, oh yeah, okay, cool. Let me do that. And then he goes into his mind and flips a switch. And now all of a sudden he's just comfortable with Chinese culture and Mexican culture and Russian culture. No, he can't do that. That's not something he has conscious control over. So repeatedly calling him a racist and a bigot and a xenophobe is not going to improve that situation. That's not actually going to help him to grow. In fact, that's going to force him now to become defensive, because he has to defend his own culture because he's loyal to his own culture. He loves his own culture because he doesn't really have anything else. He knows nothing else. So he's going to defend his God. He's going to defend his Christian ways. He's going to defend his language. He's going to defend his customs and his way of doing business. That's how humans are, by default. So if you want to truly be a compassionate political actor, you have to have compassion for people's struggles with this. And that means you have to surrender calling them racists. That's a difficult pill to swallow for many progressives. And yet, deep down, you know that what I'm telling you is correct. And when you start to accept this, this is when you go beyond green politics into stage yellow and above. So the next problem with progressive politics is with police. Especially recently, we've had a lot of situations where police brutality is blown way out of proportion, to the point where police as a whole are being demonized by the left. I watch a lot of left-wing commentators on YouTube, and the ease with which they will smear and paint all police as pigs, racists, fascists, and other sorts of labels like this is really troubling. Now, of course, there is systemic racism within police. Of course, the police can be corrupt, as can any institution, and in fact, as all institutions are to various degrees. Of course, there is excessive brutality used by the police, especially here in America. The problem, though, is that it gets completely blown out of proportion because what you see, you know, the sort of like sensational video clips that you see on YouTube or TikTok of police shooting some black man here or some unarmed black woman there, or, some mentally, disabled person here in this situation. We've all seen these clips. They're tragic clips. Of course, justice needs to be handed out in these situations, but you have to distinguish this from smearing police as a whole. Policing is a very difficult business. It's a dangerous business as well. And the problem is that the police go out every single day in this country and they serve thousands of and even millions of arrest warrants and criminal cases. They chase down, legitimate criminals, and they stop all sorts of disputes, and they do drug busts and all sorts of stuff that they do, right? They prevent a lot of crime. The problem is that they get almost no credit for that. And then if they make one mistake and it gets caught on videotape, then people lose their minds and they start to smear all of police as being this way. But that's not the case. 99% of the time, when the police are doing their work, they're doing a great job. They're professional. They're responsible. They save lives. They help people save their money from being stolen, preventing property damage and crime, and all sorts of ugly, ugly stuff. But then 1% of the time, the police are corrupt, because you have hundreds of thousands of police across the whole country. Of course, some of them are going to be corrupt. And I'm not just saying it's a few bad apples, because people say, oh, Leo, so you're just making a few bad apples case here, which the conservatives make. No, I will also admit that there are systemic problems within the police. There are problems with how the police are trained. There are problems with perhaps how the police are over-militarized. Maybe they get too many high, powerful weapons. There are problems within certain police departments. There are certain police departments around the country which literally are racist. But that doesn't mean all of them are. That just means we have to identify those and fix those problems. There are problems with how police are trained. That needs to also be identified and changed. But even admitting all those problems, in 99% of the cases, the police are still doing a good job. Now you might say, well, Leo, but that's just, it's easy for you to say that because you're white and you're affluent and you live in a good part of the country and a good part of town. Therefore, you have not experienced the kind of, bad police brutality and unfairness that I might have experienced if you, let's say, you're a minority. And I'm willing to grant you that minorities are going to, by definition, experience more unfairness if the police are majority white. Also, poor people are going to experience worse encounters with the police than affluent people. And that's unfair. But also you have to understand that there is actually the sort of affluence thing, there's actually reason for that. Because poor people are going to commit more crime, generally speaking, than affluent people, just because they have more reason to. Now, that's not going to translate the same, based on skin color. Although historically, the reason that black people commit more crime is because they're less affluent. Not so much because they're black, but because they're less affluent. And why are they less affluent? Because they were black and therefore enslaved. Therefore, they have a lot less generational wealth. So there's some complicated dynamics going on there and some sort of complicated correlations. But look, I'll grant you that minorities have it worse in terms of the police, but that still doesn't mean that the police are, on the whole, a bad thing. So one of the worst political moves that progressives have made in the last 5 years or so is this slogan of defund the police, abolish the police, defund the FBI, abolish the FBI. Now, conservatives are saying that, but they're saying that for different reasons in terms of FBI. These are stupid slogans. These are stupid policies, stupid ideas that make the left wing seem like they're stupid and actually give fuel to the right wing. This empowers the right wing. Anytime progressives go too far and do ridiculous, absurd, stupid things or try to defend stupid policy positions, that empowers the right. You understand that? Think about that. Defund the police. This slogan, I mean, if I was into conspiracy theories, I would think that the right wing came up with this slogan and fed it to the left wing just to weaken the left wing so that the right wing would win power. I don't believe that actually, but like I said, if I was into conspiracy theories, that would be a good one. But of course, progressives are stupid enough to have brought this damage onto themselves. Now, moving on to the next problem with progressive politics is the demonization and failure to properly understand the right. We've already touched on this problem, but we're going to be retouching this problem as we go down this list of problems with progressives, because this is sort of like a meta problem. Progressives are way too quick to call people racists, bigots, transphobes, homophobes, Islamophobes, and fascists. Notice that all these terms and labels, sometimes they're appropriate, but for the most part, these are actually what are called, in psychology, thought-terminating cliches. When you use one of these labels to dismiss somebody, you no longer have to assume the burden of trying to understand where that person is coming from. When you call someone a racist or a transphobe, that shuts down dialogue, but even worse than that, it shuts down your mind's capacity to understand the nuance in that person's point of view. So, for example, I've seen a lot of progressive YouTubers calling Joe Rogan a transphobe. This is a big mistake. Big mistake. And when they do this, again, this feeds into empowering the right. Now, Joe Rogan has some very strong positions on trans people in sports. And that's because he comes from sports, especially martial arts, where the physical strength differences between men and women are very significant. So basically, Joe Rogan's position is something along the lines of that, he doesn't hate trans people. He doesn't want to stop all trans people from being trans if that's what's right for them. But his position is that when it comes to sports, and especially when it comes to competitive physical sports like, let's say, boxing or fighting, in these cases, if you allow trans people to participate in the sport, especially if you allow trans men to compete against normal women, this is unfair. This creates biological imbalances, hormonal, there's a hormonal advantage there. There's a structural advantage just to your bone structure and all this kind of stuff comes from being born a biological man. That even if you transition, you're still going to have a huge advantage, right? So this is Joe Rogan's position. This is a legitimate position to have. This does not make him a transphobe. But a lot of times what I see is that progressives are so eager just to call somebody a transphobe who might have a slightly different view of trans issues and doesn't, toe the progressive party line, doesn't just buy into all the groupthink automatically. They just dismiss that person. Oh, he's just a transphobe. No, he's not a transphobe. It's just that you're stuck in groupthink. And anything outside your groupthink, you have no explanation for, and you don't want to engage in that. You don't want to take responsibility for understanding that, because maybe there's some good points there that Joe Rogan is making. But you don't want to consider those, so you just dismiss him as a transphobe. This was one example. I only use Joe Rogan here because he's like the most well-known guy. But I see this kind of problem happening over and over again, not just with the label transphobe, but homophobe, Islamophobe, fascist, racist, bigot, and other sorts of labels like this. And this is just a more general problem that stage green, this is one of the characteristic problems of any stage below stage yellow, any tier 1 stage, is that stage green does not have a proper understanding of the stages below it. It does not have a proper understanding of stage orange and of stage blue. Likewise, stage orange does not have a proper understanding of stage green and stage blue, and likewise, stage blue does not have a proper understanding of stage orange and stage green. So the stages are misunderstanding each other, and in order to move to stage yellow, tier 2 or above, to really have a conscious politics, which is what we're trying to move towards here, which is the whole objective of this conversation, to get there, we need the stages understanding each other. Fundamentally, progressives do not understand conservatives. This is a true statement. They think they understand. They think they're better than. They think they're more evolved. They think they don't need to understand because they're already more evolved. This is a mistake. This is a huge mistake. You need to understand the conservative mind if you're a progressive, and you need an accurate understanding of the conservative mind, and you should care if you have an inaccurate understanding of the conservative mind. That's a huge point. Think about why what I'm telling you is important. I'm not going to give you the answer. I want you to think about that. I'm just telling you that it is the case that if you're a progressive and you do not care about the accuracy of your understanding of the conservative worldview, that is going to come back and hurt you. It's going to hurt you in many ways. I want you to contemplate what those ways are. I'll just give you a couple of pointers here. It'll hurt you in 2 ways at least. One way it'll hurt you is it'll simply hurt you in your ability to actually win elections. Because a lot of people, at least half the people in your country, are conservative. If you don't accurately understand their worldview, how are you going to win elections? So this is just a purely, selfish reason to care about why you should have an accurate understanding of your opponent's worldview. It's not like we're saying that conservatives are like 10% of the population. If conservatives were only 10% of the population, maybe it wouldn't matter, how accurately you understood the worldview. No, conservatives are like at least half of the population. So it's pretty important, don't you think? If you are not able to understand the worldview of half the world's population, that's pretty important. That should worry you. And I guarantee you, as a progressive, you do not have an accurate understanding of the conservative worldview. You tell yourself that you do, but you don't. What you have is you have a demonized straw man version of it, which is not the same thing. Now, again, you might say here, oh, but Leo, but conservatives are even worse. Conservatives don't understand the progressive worldview. Yes, of course they don't. Of course they don't. Of course they're even worse at this. Of course, conservatives demonize and strawman the progressive worldview. But we're not talking about that in this episode. Remember, I told you this is going to be an imbalanced episode. We're only talking about your problems as a progressive. I don't care about the conservatives' problems here. They have a lot of problems. Even more than you. But we're talking about you. See, at some point, you have to stop pointing your finger at the conservatives and all of their problems, and you have to ask yourself, but what about my problems? Because ultimately, you're responsible for you. You can't fix the conservatives' problems for them. Only they can solve their own problems, and only you can solve your problems as a progressive. So in this episode, I don't care what the conservative problems are. It doesn't matter. What matters, if you're a progressive, is your problems, your blind spots, your weaknesses. That's what we're working on. That's what it means to take responsibility and to develop yourself. One of the biggest problems we have in politics is that everybody is pointing out somebody else's problems, but nobody is taking responsibility for solving their own internal problems. Therefore, how can we all develop and grow? For example, if I'm trying to give advice to men about how to improve their relations with women, it's pointless to me talking about the problems that women have. Now, if I'm talking to women about improving their relationships with men, then I'm going to be talking about women's problems. And if I'm talking to men, I'm going to be talking about men's problems, because only the men can fix their problems and only the women can fix their own problems. You see? There's no point in me making an advice video for men about being better with women, and the whole video is just me criticizing women. That doesn't solve anything. You see? So it's like that with politics too. So one reason you should care about misunderstanding the right is because just for winning elections, it'll help you to win elections. But the second reason is because, look, you're going to have to live with these people for the rest of your life. Conservatives are not going anywhere. You're not going to kill half the country. They're not going anywhere, and you're not going to brainwash them out of their conservatism. You're not going to wake them up out of it. Maybe you will with a few people, but for the most part, the percentage of conservatives to liberals, left to right, in this country is not going to change throughout your entire lifetime. It's going to be the same percentage for the most part. So you're going to have to, live with these people, work with these people. And ultimately, you're going to have to make peace with these people. Because if you don't make peace with these people in your own mind, you're going to be at war with them forever. Don't you think that's a problem? Now, see, a rabid progressive here would say, well, Leo, but I don't want to make peace with them. They need to be fought and defeated. Think a little bit deeper about what you're actually saying. Do you want peace in the world or not? If you're a progressive, supposedly you're pro-peace. Yet the only version of pro-peace that you're for is the peace that comes after you exterminate half the population. That's a problem. I'm not saying you're going to exterminate half the population, but just think about how your worldview is working. The only way you will have peace of mind as a progressive is if half the world is dead. That's literally your position. I'm suggesting to you that's a problem. I'm suggesting to you that that is not how we do conscious politics, and that there is a better way to go about doing politics. So think about that real hard. And stop using these thought-terminating cliches. Stop calling people just in a knee-jerk way, calling them racists and bigots and homophobes and transphobes. Actually engage with them. Stop calling people fascists. Engage with them. Try to really understand their worldview. This will be really good for you. Now, one objection that a progressive could raise here is like, well, Leo, but if I'm going to open my mind to fascist ideas and homophobic and transphobic ideas, isn't that like opening my mind to the wrong things? And that in this way, I'm going to somehow compromise with the devil by opening my mind to the devil, by trying to understand the devil. No, that's incorrect. Understanding the devil fully is actually how you defeat the devil. You cannot defeat the devil by demonizing the devil. There's actually much deeper spiritual reasons for why that's the case. I won't go into that here, but you cannot defeat evil by fighting evil. That has never worked, and it will never work. The only way you can defeat evil is by loving it to death, which requires you understanding it to death, which requires opening your mind to it. All right, moving on to the next point. The next problem with progressive politics is excessive forms of what I call idiot compassion. What is idiot compassion? Idiot compassion is when you place compassion for the suffering of others above everything else. So one example of this might be a sort of a naive pacifism where you say, like, let's abolish the military entirely, let's disarm all our nuclear weapons, let's disarm and destroy all our guns, and we're just going to live happily all together with no weapons in this sort of utopia. Because we don't want war. War is not very compassionate and violence is not very good. So therefore, the solution to violence is just to eliminate all the weapons. This is sort of an idiot compassion. This would be a policy that comes from idiot compassion. And progressives tend to be more prone to errors of idiot compassion because they tend to have more compassion than conservatives. The problem with conservatives, they don't have enough compassion. The problem with progressives, they have too much compassion. They have so much compassion, it makes them so idealistic that they don't realize that life and survival are brutal things, and that sometimes by taking an overly compassionate approach to some situation, you actually make it worse, not better. A classic example of this in your personal life is, for example, when you're trying to break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend. If you're very compassionate, you can empathize with how much you're going to break this person's heart by breaking up with them. But you also know deep down that this person is not right for you. So what do? Well, out of compassion, you hold it off and hold it off and hold it off. For years, you don't tell them that you're going to break up with them because you don't want to break their heart. But of course, the more years go by where you don't tell them, the worse it gets. And eventually it's going to break up anyways because you already know they're not right for you. You guys are not compatible. So you're just, you're delaying the inevitable. And out of compassion, actually, you're going to end up breaking this person's heart even more. Because if you told them right off the bat and did a clean break with them, yeah, you would hurt their heart. But they would move on, and you would move on, and they would be able to find a partner, and you'd be able to find a new partner, and things would go fine. But when you start, that would be like the honest, sort of like the, you're taking the Band-Aid or you're just ripping the Band-Aid off in one clean swipe. But when you're slowly peeling that Band-Aid out of compassion, it actually makes the total pain worse. So I noticed that progressives tend to fall into this problem. Idiot compassion. What you have to understand is that good intentions and compassion are not enough to fix many of the world's systemic problems. This is especially true when it comes to war. Progressives tend to have a sort of a blind spot when it comes to war and violence because they just instinctively, progressives don't like war and violence. And so we want to just do anything possible to minimize it as quickly as possible. But actually, sometimes war, violence, and conflict are necessary for a greater good. And that by delaying this war or conflict, you actually, out of compassion, you're delaying it, you're trying to avoid it, but actually you're going to cause more misery by doing so. Okay, the next point, the next problem is, it's a big one. It's this naive ideological obsession with socialism and Marxism that we see amongst progressives. This is such a huge topic, I could have a separate episode just about this. I've been observing a lot of debates between capitalists, libertarians, socialists, communists, tankies, Marxists. I see a lot of blind spots here. And a lot of the ways in which Marxists argue, their talking points, are very problematic. So I'm going to point some of these out. Now, that does not mean that I'm pro-capitalist here. Again, this is going to be one-sided. I'm just criticizing the ways in which socialism and Marxism are argued for by the left. All right, so the first problem here is I see a lot of parroting of socialist and Marxist talking points. Just parroting, like people will say, well, in Marx, in Das Kapital, on this page here, he said this. And he said that this is the definition of exploitation, and this is the definition of labor and capital, and they just use these Marxist definitions. These are just talking points. This doesn't mean that they have anything to do with reality, or that it's going to lead to a better society. So first of all, understand that. The next problem is some socialists and Marxists go so far as to advocate for full-on socialism and full-on Marxist revolution, even sometimes through violence. This is very dangerous and very problematic. They don't understand what they're advocating for or what kind of consequences they could have. Again, this is sort of coming from like an idiot compassion. Because look, any reasonable person sees the evils of capitalism and the very many problems and injustices that come with a capitalist system. However, that does not mean that socialism and Marxism is automatically going to be a better system. And just because you are compassionate for the poor and the exploited workers under capitalism does not mean that that compassion and those good intentions of yours will translate over into a better system after a socialist revolution. You have to consider that your socialist revolution might actually lead to a worse system after all is said and done, even though it came from very good intentions. In fact, we have a long history. The whole 20th century is a history of this. Now, I am not being as naive as many right-wingers are that just because, we had the 20th century and we've tried socialism and Marxism, let's say within Russia, within China, South America and Cuba and other places, Venezuela and so forth, that just because it hasn't worked or there's been problems with it, that now we need to forget about socialism and that now socialism is dead. No, there are good ideas within socialism. There are many valid critiques of capitalism within Marxism. We can acknowledge all that, and yet still we can also understand that staging a socialist or Marxist revolution can be extremely problematic, and that you can easily make things worse than they are. A lot of the problem is that to get one of these socialist systems in place, you're going to have to use authoritarian means to do so. At least historically, that's how it's always gone down. Now you might say, Leo, but the socialism of the 21st century will be implemented without any authoritarian means. Oh yeah? Where has that ever worked? I mean, of course, your intentions are to implement socialism in the most peaceful way possible. But the reality is, socialism, especially when you're trying to actually implement it through some kind of revolution, this is happening through deep ideology and groupthink. The only way you're going to stage a revolution is through ideology and groupthink. You're going to have to raise hordes and masses of people to stage your revolution. And as you do that, the people become stupider and stupider. And they commit all the evils that humans commit when they are organized into a mob under some ideology. Doesn't even matter what the ideology is, just the fact that you have millions of people organized under some ideology. They're not thinking independently for themselves. This is going to create a lot of evil, even if the ideology is very good. And it's going to lead to all sorts of corruption and abuses of power and authority. So even though you might be the leader of a peaceful socialist revolution, once it actually gets going, it's going to get out of control. See, you're going to create a Frankenstein monster. And then this monster will eat you alive. And then this monster will become power hungry. And it will go on without you in authoritarian ways to try to survive. Because we're talking about survival here. We're talking about collective systems of survival. See my episode called Collective Ego, which talks all about this kind of stuff. Other problems I see within this domain is also tankies. Tankies are basically socialists or Marxists who whitewash communism, who actually believe that, oh, Leo, Soviet communism wasn't so bad and Chinese communism wasn't so bad. There's a lot of problems with that. I won't even get into that here. You have to acknowledge to yourself, if you're a Marxist or a socialist, that actually Marxism and socialism, these are dogmas. This is groupthink. You didn't develop these ideas on your own. You probably didn't even read these ideas from Marx himself. You probably got this mostly from hearsay and groupthink in the university you went to, or the people you hung out with when you were young. It's a dogma. Now, there are some valid points within Marxism, but there's also a lot of wrong stuff within Marxism. I'll be explaining some of that here, and in the future I'll have an episode just purely about the problems with socialism, Marxism versus capitalism. And to admit that there are problems within Marxism does not mean that you have to ignore all the problems with capitalism. It's not an either or. See, just because I'm criticizing socialism and Marxism here does not make me some sort of arch-capitalist, libertarian, neoliberal. You have to be careful as you're listening to me making these points. I'm speaking from tier 2. Spiral dynamics tier 2, right? I'm speaking from a non-ideological place. So whenever I'm criticizing capitalism or socialism or progressivism or whatever, it's not because I'm defending its opposite. And it's also not because I'm just some sort of third way neoliberal. You might say, oh, Leo is just sitting here and he just wants to split everything down the middle. He doesn't want to be too far right and he doesn't want it to be too far left. So what is he? He's just some neoliberal centrist, some sort of like Bill Clinton type of person, right? Wrong. That's actually a huge mistake that progressives make, which we'll get to further down the list. This is a huge point. But a lot of times what progressives do is in order to maintain their ideological position of progressivism and to not have it challenged, what they do is they will demonize anybody. I mean, obviously they demonize anyone who's on the far right, but they will even demonize anyone who's even remotely giving the appearance of being centrist, because, you know, progressives will demonize centrists as well. And then that makes them just completely stuck in their bubble of progressivism. But what you have to understand is that not only is there the far right and the moderate right, and then there's the centrism and moderate left, and then there's progressivism, there's even something beyond all of those categories, which is tier 2. Tier 2 can smell like centrism, but it's not. You don't even know what tier 2 is yet. And many progressives are so simple-minded and so quick to demonize that not only will they demonize tier 2, they will even deny of course, they will demonize centrism, and they will even deny the existence of moderate conservatism. They will say there's no such thing as a moderate conservative. All conservatives are right-wing extremists and fascists. Just the moderate ones are just pretending. So see, this gets extremely tricky. We'll get to that point further down. I want to stay on the Marxism track for a bit more here. So progressives, socialists, and Marxists have a problem admitting where socialism has truly failed, where it's been truly tried and truly failed. So there's a sort of a sleight of hand here, sort of a no true Scotsman argument, it's called. This kind of bit of logic which says that, well, yeah, I mean, socialism has been tried in the Soviet era and in Venezuela and in China. It's been tried, but that wasn't the real socialism. The real socialism is the socialism we're going to start in the 21st century. That'll be the real socialism. That will work. But the other ones weren't real, therefore they failed. I'm not saying that you can't have better forms of socialism. I think you can. I think that socialism failed in the past, but maybe in the future it actually could work. But you have to be very honest with yourself about holding your own feet to the fire and admitting when real socialism has been tried and failed. Because you see, the problem here is that in being so idealistic about your socialism, you could be implementing and advocating for socialism, but then every time it fails, you could fool yourself into saying that, oh, well, it failed because capitalism made it fail, not because of the inherent problems within socialism. But what if it's failing not because of capitalism, but actually because of the inherent problems within socialism. How would you know that? You have to keep your mind open to that possibility, because it could be possible that socialism as a system, as a whole, will never, ever work anywhere. That is possible. You want to keep your mind open to that possibility. Now, I'm not saying that's true necessarily. I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying that these systems, capitalism, socialism, libertarianism, whatever it is, these systems are so complicated that no human being actually can predict whether they will work or not. It has to be tested and tried. And also, what matters is not just your ideals of it, but how it works in practice, right? There's an ideal of capitalism in theory, and then there's what capitalism looks like in practice. Likewise, there's an ideal of what socialism or Marxism is in theory, the utopia of it, where it's all perfect. And then there's how it actually looks when selfish, egotistical, ignorant people implement it. And you see, it doesn't really matter that socialism or Marxism works great in your mind's eye, where egotistical people are not implementing it. Because in the real world, we're dealing with very egotistical people. Even progressive people are very egotistical, closed-minded, biased, selfish, ignorant people. And that's the best case scenario, is that those people will be implementing your socialist system. But in reality, even lower kinds of people will be implementing your system. Even lower than progressives. Spiral dynamic stage orange and blue and even red. So what's going to happen with your Marxist utopia when stage red gets a hold of it? This is something that most socialists and Marxists are not prepared to answer for. Also, you have to recognize that it may be the case that society right now is not developed enough to sustain socialism. Have you considered that possibility? After all, how would you know? How would you know that mankind right now is developed enough? Look, maybe in 300 to 500 years, mankind will be developed enough and selfless enough and conscious enough and compassionate enough and objective enough to create and sustain a socialist system. But not today. And if you take a look at the percentages of spiral development and ego development, stages red, blue, orange, green, when you look at those percentages, that'll be very sobering for you, because you'll realize that the majority of mankind on this planet is stage blue and lower. Not even stage orange yet. Most people in America are stage blue or orange, and they are just struggling to get a handle on blue and orange. They're struggling. It'll take them their whole lives just to master orange. That's the reality of our situation. The problem is that progressives tend to overestimate the general level of development of most human beings on the planet and their fellow citizens. And the reason that is because when you are one of the most developed groups in the world, if you grew up in a first world democracy, in America, in a blue state, in a big city like LA, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and you went to a good university, and you had a bunch of liberal professors and friends, and you traveled around the world, and all of this you did because you had the money to do it. Understand this. Without money, none of this would have been possible for you. You were so lucky to be born into that. 90% of the population in this world will never experience that. They are nowhere close to experiencing that because they simply don't have the financial resources to do it and the opportunity. And they were just born in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's very easy to get your sense of the world skewed by the fact that you grew up and were educated in these stage green progressive bubbles, which are the universities for the most part in these blue states and blue cities. But the majority of the citizens on whom your government and economy must depend are not at that stage of development. They have a very different value set than you, very different worldview than you. They have different fears and concerns than you. They have a different culture than you. They have different biases and preferences than you. Progressives don't understand that. It's going to take the majority of mankind a couple hundred years just to reach the point of where some wealthy, Berkeley student or UCLA student is at today. That's the reality of our situation. Here's another point about socialism. You have to admit to yourself as a socialist that there's a great disparity in value between people's work. The majority of people are lazy, uncreative, and uninnovative in their work. And there is a correlation between value creation and wealth. Wealthy people are not just wealthy because they stole that money through some sort of exploitative capitalist system. Wealthy people, generally speaking, are wealthy because they've generated more value for the world. But be careful here, because I'm not denying that there are inherent inequalities within capitalism and that capitalism is not strictly meritocratic. So it might sound like I'm just arguing for meritocracy here. That's not the case. I fully recognize that in capitalism, there's a lot of exploitation going on, a lot of abuse of power, abuse of hierarchy, and that some capitalists become very, very wealthy, even though they are a net negative to society. Or they do some sort of unethical practices, like they sell drugs, or they sell weapons, or they do pollution or whatever. That definitely goes on, for sure. And it's definitely the case that under the capitalist system we have right now, workers are not being fairly compensated. They are being exploited in many cases. When a CEO of some giant corporation is earning, $50 million a year in stock options, but his secretary isn't even able to afford, healthcare for her children, that's a problem. And that's not fair. And that needs to be addressed in the future, and it will be addressed in the future. But that does not mean that a simple socialist system will actually address this problem. Because what I see is that a lot of socialists tend to just assume that everybody tends to kind of work about the same and they all deserve roughly the same amount of compensation. That's not the case. There are some people who are born with extraordinary talents and creative abilities or intelligence or whatever, and also not just born with, but also how they're shaped by their environment, such that they become much greater value creators than your typical employee. In fact, your typical employee is actually quite lazy, quite dumb, quite uninterested in taking responsibility for doing business. A lot of people, rather than taking on the burdens of entrepreneurship, which requires extraordinary responsibility, and that comes with stress. Emotional labor and stress comes with being responsible for employing 100 people and making sure that you can meet all their paychecks come Christmas time. That takes an enormous amount of responsibility. The average worker does not want anything to do with this kind of responsibility. They just want to show up, be told what to do, how to do it, and then receive a paycheck guaranteed. There's a cost for that. The cost for that is that you don't earn very much. And the reason that is because you don't take on the creative responsibilities that come with generating a lot of value for the world. Socialists tend to fall into this trap of thinking that, well, wealthy people are wealthy people just because they've exploited a lot through the capitalist system. Sometimes that's true, but that's not always true. You have to admit as a socialist that a lot of wealthy people genuinely create 1,000,000% more value than your average employee. Not because they work more hours. See, that's too simplistic. Because if you take a simplistic calculation of how many hours a CEO works versus how many hours an employee works, like the Starbucks of CEO does not work that many more hours than the typical employee of, the barista at Starbucks. Maybe let's say the CEO works twice as many hours. The barista works 40 and he works 80. Okay, well, does that justify him earning 1,000 times more? Of course not. But what you have to understand is that it's not just about the hours you work. It's not even about how hard you work. It's about how smart you work. And different kinds of work generates value in very different degrees. See? Just because you work, let's say, 100 hours a week pouring coffee as a barista, you might work really hard and you might please all your customers and you might pour every cup of coffee perfectly. And you might think, well, that justifies this barista getting as much as the CEO. No, it doesn't. Because in the end, you're just pouring fucking coffee, which has almost zero value to anybody in the world. So no, Leo, but coffee's valuable. Yeah, it's a little bit valuable. But compared to actually managing a company like Starbucks, pouring cups of coffee is worth nothing. You have to understand that. There is such an enormous value discrepancy between managing a logistics chain of 100,000 people around the entire world versus pouring a few cups of coffee. Even pouring 1,000, how many cups of coffee does a barista pour per week? 1,000, let's say. You might say, that's a lot of coffee. Yeah, but it's nothing compared to managing the logistics chain of Starbucks for the entire planet. This is something that I see a lot of Marxists and socialists not understand and not really appreciate. Because there's a sort of demonization of wealthy people, CEOs, executives, capitalists. And look, a lot of these people are scumbags. I'll grant you that. Many of these top-tier CEOs and capitalists, they're literally sociopaths and psychopaths. Clinically so. Many of them are very greedy. Many of them will exploit their workers and not give a fuck about their workers. But still, that's a percentage of them. That's not all of them. That's still a minority of them. Actually, if you're honest, the majority of the world's top CEOs, capitalists, millionaires, billionaires, people who run giant businesses in a very successful manner, the majority of these people are actually extremely responsible, extremely diligent, extremely hardworking, polite, kind. They care about their employees. They care about their customers. They care about not cheating and exploiting their customers and their employees. Within certain tolerances and within certain bounds. I'm not saying they're saints. And the reason they have to be that way is because if they weren't that way, then they couldn't be as successful as they are. Sometimes you can get a sociopath that gets really high up and is able to, dominate people. But especially these days, the way that most companies are run these days, you can't be a sociopath and successfully manage a company with 10,000 people in it. A lot of times that just won't fly. You're going to piss off way too many people and they're going to kick you out. The board of directors will just fire you. It's not like the CEO is like a tyrant of a corporation. Most CEOs will easily get fired by the board of directors or by the stockholders if they act out or act like an asshole or create public relations nightmares for their companies or for the investors. So it's not like there's not accountability. There is accountability. It's not perfect, but you have to understand that the reason that these sociopaths, if a sociopath is able to climb high up in the corporate hierarchy and is able to amass a lot of power and wealth, the reason that is actually because that sociopath is actually generating an enormous amount of value for people. You may not like him personally. You may think he's an asshole. You may think he's a racist and a sexist and maybe he's even raped a few people. And you might be horrified by all this. But the reality is that if he's still in power, the reason he's still in power is because the investors and even the employees, the majority of them who are working under him, need him because he's generating so much fucking value for the whole organization. You might say, well, Leo, this is kind of a sick way to think about it. Surely if some employee, some CEO raped a few people, he should be fired for that. It doesn't matter how many people he's helped, how many customers he's helped. It doesn't matter how many products he's sold, how much money he's made, because just, on moral principle, if he raped a couple of people, then he should be fired. See, this is where you have to be very careful, because that's your sort of idiot compassion kicking in, right? Because you're not really realistically looking at how survival works. See, in the progressive's mind, if a guy raped a few people, nothing can ever redeem him. In reality, the way it works is that if a guy raped a few people, but on the other hand, let's say he employs 10,000 people and he's able to provide them with paychecks every single month consistently for decades, that counterbalances any people he'll ever be able to rape in his entire life. You might say, well, that's a very sick way to think about things. Yeah, but the way the world works is it works on survival, not on your moral principles and virtues. And progressives have this problem with being way too moralistic and too idealistic about life. And the reason that is usually because their survival is secured. See, when your survival is secured, let's say your parents pay for your education and they pay for your rent and they bought you your car, all this, it's very easy to be a socialist and an idealist under this situation because you didn't actually have to fucking kill anybody for survival. The majority of people in the world have to kill others to survive. Survival is literally life and death for them. So for them, they can't be too moralistic about it. When you're not able to pay your bills, when you don't have money, this changes the entire dynamic. Let's say nobody will give you a job in this economy and nobody will pay your bills except one guy, this one entrepreneur. You can work for him and he will provide you with a consistent paycheck and a great job, but he's also a rapist and you know it. What do? Do you take that job? You might say, no, Leo, I'm too moral. I would never take that job. Okay. But what about the millions of other people who are in poverty, who would benefit from having that job? You say, well, they shouldn't take it either. Okay, but what if you have children? Let's say, there's a mother who has a family of 3 young children who need dental care, child care, medical care, education, school, healthy food, all that. Can she take this job working for this rapist? You say, no, Leo, she can't either. Okay, well then you're out of idiot compassion, you're making her children suffer. Because her children now are going to be poor. They're not going to get the education. And they themselves, being poor, are going to turn to theft and perhaps violence, and perhaps rape. So who's to say what the net positive and the net negative are? It's not so simple as you think. You see, these are the realities of survival. You have to also admit as a socialist that self-made wealth there is such a thing as self-made wealth. It is possible for you to just be extraordinarily creative and hardworking and to create wealth, basically out of nothing. That does not mean that capitalist systems don't exist and that a lot of wealth is not generated through the exploitation of various kinds of sneaky capitalist systems. In reality, that is how the majority of the world's wealth is created, is through exploitation of various sorts of capitalistic systems. That is true. However, that's not exclusively true. It is possible to do capitalism in more conscious ways, in ways that do not exploit others. Exploitation is not inherent to capitalism. This is a big point of contention between myself and Marxists. Is Marxists will say that, no, Leo, exploitation, the way, you don't understand the technical definition of exploitation, the way Marx defined it, is that, capitalists have to exploit workers. This is actually something that someone like a Richard Wolff, professor of socialism, talks about. Actually, he's wrong about this. So let's talk about this for a second. So there's something that socialists don't acknowledge, is that socialists don't acknowledge that making a profit off of employees is not exploitation, it's absolutely necessary. Yes, employers make profit off of employees, but if this didn't happen, there couldn't be a business. There couldn't be a corporation. The boss of a corporation has to look out for the survival of the corporation. That's his number one priority. A corporation cannot survive without profit. So the boss's number one priority is to make sure that there's profit for the corporation. Because if there's not profit for the corporation, he can't pay his employees. And if he can't pay his employees, he's failed everybody. Everybody's worse off. Right? So this Marxist definition that any amount of profit made off employees, no, it can't work that way. Because you see, corporations are themselves entities that have to care about survival. You have to think of a corporation as an organism, as a living organism that is competing against other corporations. It needs to have some sort of buffer or profit margin, or basically a savings. That savings is its lifeline. If a corporation loses all of its savings and it's not making a profit, then it's dead. And then, of course, anyone who depends upon that corporation to pay for childcare and so forth, they're also dead. You get this? And corporations are always competing with each other in a global marketplace. It's actually very difficult to start a business and to sustain that business for decade after decade after decade. Most businesses go out of business because it's so hard to survive as a corporation. Even giant corporations like General Motors or General Electric, or you might even take a corporation like Amazon. You might think, well, Leo, Amazon is making so many billions of dollars. It's the best of its kind at what it does, online retail. It's cornered the market. It's a monopoly effectively. It has over 50% of all internet sales and so forth. And it's making billions of dollars, and therefore it has nothing to worry about. But the reality, this is just a reality, is that if the managers and executives of Amazon stopped worrying every single night about the survival of Amazon, after 20 to 50 years, Amazon would die. It would be outcompeted by somebody else. That's the reality. So the executives and managers of Amazon are staying up late every single night. They're not able to sleep every single night because they're so afraid of somebody stealing their business. That's the reality of a giant corporation. It's not so easy. These giant corporations go out of business all the time. They get sued for billions of dollars all the time. A recession could come along and could wipe out entire businesses. COVID came. Lots of businesses were killed by COVID. Why? Because they didn't have enough reserves. They didn't have enough profit margins. They weren't thinking far enough ahead. And then they had to get subsidies from the government. The entire airline industry was basically nearly knocked out and killed. If not for government subsidies, probably all the airlines would be out of business by now, thanks to COVID. Why is that? Because business is extremely difficult. Remember, business is not just business. Business is not just making a bunch of money so you can drive a Lamborghini. Business is about survival. Never forget that. So making profit off employees, yeah, that's absolutely necessary. Now, Richard Wolff could counter-argue and say, well, but Leo, companies make way too much profit off employees. And here I would agree that sometimes they do. But who's to say when they are making too much? You see how relative and subjective this is? Who's to say what's too much of a profit? That's not easy to say. And if the company should ever go out of business, then actually that's proof that they weren't making enough profit off their employees. And that's also possible. One of the things that Richard Wolff does not admit is that a lot of companies, because you see, when you're an employee at a company, your paycheck is guaranteed, pretty much. No matter whether the project you're working on succeeds or doesn't, you're going to get your money. But that's not the case for the company as a whole. It's very often the case that a company will hire an employee, the employee will work on them on some project for 5 years, the project will fail, the company will lose a bunch of money, but the employees still come out ahead with profit. So what is that worth to you? That guarantee of a paycheck, that's worth something to the employee. That justifies the employer taking a profit off the top, and even an excessive profit off the top of your wage. Because the reality is that there's no guarantee, like, for example, when Elon Musk starts SpaceX to launch rockets, he has to pay, I think his investment in SpaceX was like $100 million just to get it off the ground. For that first $100 million, they were not even able to launch one successful rocket. That's how much investment it took just to create the first successful rocket. And, if they can't launch even one successful rocket, that means they can't get a single client. If they can't get a single client, the company's dead. But the employees who were working on those rockets for like the first 5 or 10 years before they launched the first successful one, those employees, they all had to get a guaranteed paycheck. Elon Musk, whatever asshole he is, whatever your opinions about him might be. I don't have a very high opinion of his political positions, or, sometimes he's a troll online or something like that. But here's one thing you can't fault Elon Musk for, is that all the employees who worked under him in SpaceX, they all got their paycheck and they were all able to feed their children. I'm sure there were some exceptions, but for the most part, like 99% of his employees, they got paid and they were able to feed their children. That's not a small thing. That's a huge thing. Don't take that for granted. That's not guaranteed. It didn't have to happen that way. If he mismanaged that company, they would not have launched that first rocket, and they would have gone out of business. They almost went out of business. They were so close to going out of business that the last rocket they launched before they launched the successful one, if it failed, that's it. That would have been the end. And all of the employees would have been fired. And that's why nowadays, Elon Musk takes a huge profit off the top of all of his employees' wages, is because he risked $100 million of his own money to gamble on this working out, and it just so happened that it did, but it easily might not have. And in fact, most businesses who try to do this, they fail and they lose their money. But when the business loses its money, the employees don't lose anything for the most part. They could lose their jobs, but for the most part, they get their paychecks. Occasionally, they don't get paid, but that's technically illegal. So keep that in mind. A lot of the problem is that guys like Richard Wolff and other Marxists and socialists, they don't acknowledge that capital itself has enormous value. Capital investment takes serious risk, and basically, it's not possible to create anything of deep value in the world without a capital investment. And you might say, well, yeah, Leo, but that's just the capitalist system. No. The requirement of capital to create amazing products is not a product of capitalism as a system. It's way more fundamental than that. Before there was capitalism as a system, capital was still required to create great things. For example, let's say we have two people living in the forest. One person is kind of lazy and only works 20 hours a day. The other person is really ambitious and hardworking and works 80 hours a day. Then, 10 years goes by. The first person in those 10 years working 20 hours a day, kind of being lazy about it and not being very intelligent either, right? Because it's not just how hard you work, it's also how smart you work. He's not very smart. So he works in a kind of a piss poor way, and he's able to build a little shack for himself. That's his capital. That's all the value he has. That's his whole life savings, his little shack. The other guy who was working way harder and way smarter, managing a whole group of people, he was able to build like a whole, castle for himself in the same amount of time. Now, the guy who built a shack might look at the guy with the castle and say, well, but that's not fair. How come that guy has a castle and I only have a shack? But in this case, the situation is perfectly fair. There was no capitalist system that prevented you from building a castle. You just didn't work as hard and as smart as the other guy. Now, here's a further point though, further wrinkle. Let's say that now both of these guys want to start some new project. Some new kind of like, business venture, we might say, to create something good for the world. Let's say they want to build a temple, a religious temple, so people can come and worship. Let's say they believe in the same God. Okay. Can you see, though, that the guy with the castle is in a much better position to build that temple than the guy with the shack? Because the guy with the shack, his shack can only hold him and maybe his small family of wife and child. That's all his shack can support. Whereas the guy with the whole fucking castle, he can support and pay for the livelihoods of 100 other people. It's a lot easier to build a temple with 100 people than it is with a wife and a child. In fact, it's impossible to build a temple with 3 people, but it is with 100. So this guy who worked much harder, he has more capital. He's developed more capital that he can actually use to create new projects. And that is extremely powerful and valuable. And the problem is that people like Richard Wolff will dismiss the value of that. And yet, in reality, to create new businesses, new products, new technologies, you need a buildup of capital. And now, of course, the question is, where does that capital come from? I mean, nowadays, most capital does not come from you just working really hard. Most capital comes from getting loans from banks. So in that sense, that's correct. But you have to understand, where did capital originally come from? All capital originally came from human labor. Someone had to build it. Someone had to create it. And people don't work at the same rates. And they don't work with the same intelligence. Some people are way more productive than others, therefore they generate a lot more capital. Also, some people, it's also a question of how do you manage your capital? Because look, if you have 2 people who are equally hardworking, equally smart working, let's say this guy builds a castle and this guy builds a castle. Now they have equal capital. They can go build the temple. But let's say this guy is a gambler and a drunk, and he wastes his capital on, on prostitutes and Lamborghinis and other things. And this guy is very responsible, and he saves all his capital. In fact, he makes very wise investments. He makes investments into other kinds of businesses, because he's got a savvy business mind. He knows which kind of businesses are going to be good. And this guy here, he doesn't. He invests in all the wrong businesses. Well, 10 years later, what happens? This guy is broke. He has no more capital. And this guy has 10 times more capital than he started with. That's not a mistake. That's exactly how it should be. The problem with Marxists and socialists is that they tend to treat this as some kind of mistake. This inequality is not a mistake. The guy who's a gambler and a drunk and makes all wrong investments, he should lose all of his capital. And there's a lot of value created by using your capital responsibly. And if you actually try to go do some investing yourself in the stock market or in some businesses, you'll notice how difficult it is. Most investments in businesses, they fail. The way venture capitalism works is that you invest in 100 businesses, 95% of them fail, 5% of them succeed, and you hope that those 5 that do succeed end up making more money than all those 95 that went out of business. That's venture capital for you. And knowing how to pick the right businesses, this is not easy. Knowing how to make good investments with your capital, very difficult. Most people are piss poor investors. They will invest their money into some stupid crap coin, Bitcoin bullshit that loses all its value. It takes a lot of intelligence to know how to invest resources, allocate resources in the right ways that actually generate jobs and technology and success for people, not just for yourself, but for others around you. See, this is not just about personally making money for yourself. Because when you make wise investments, this doesn't just help you, it helps society, it helps other people get jobs. It helps mothers to pay for their child's health care. So, you need to appreciate that bosses, executives, capitalists, and investors, these are not just greedy, evil people. They assume a lot of risk and responsibility as leaders. And it's way harder to do their jobs than you think. Now, are they sometimes corrupt? Yes. Do they sometimes exploit their employees? Definitely. Do they sometimes do evil things like pollute the environment and cause wars and things like this? Yes, definitely. And those all need to be addressed. But still, what I see is generally that most Marxists and socialists do not appreciate the difficulty of being a great business leader and the kind of responsibility that comes with that. And therefore, the kind of rewards that are necessary, to compensate people for that. Still, this is not a justification for earning excessive amounts of profit. We should think about maybe capping how much you can earn or adjusting our tax system and so forth. These are all fair game, need to be considered. But just be careful. Under your socialist Marxist system, you just got to ask yourself, how are you going to determine who's earning how much? Is there going to be some human that determines this? Who gets to determine this? If the market's not determining it because you think the market's unfair, okay, fine. So the market won't be determining the salaries. Who will be? Who gets to determine what's a healthy, fair salary for a Starbucks barista versus a Starbucks CEO? How many times more should a Starbucks CEO earn than the Starbucks barista? 10 times? 100 times? What are you going to say is fair versus unfair? And how are you going to create a consensus around this across the entire economy for every type of job? How are you going to get everybody to agree with you? Is that even possible. I also notice a lot of demonization, just outright demonization and smearing of capitalism and capitalists and people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and so forth. You have to be careful about that. And I'm not saying these are good people. Some of these people could be scumbags and assholes and whatnot. But you have to be careful about demonizing this stuff. There's also a failure to acknowledge that capitalism is the default way that humans do business. Now, you might say technically capitalism hasn't existed for very long. It's only existed for a couple hundred years. You know, the modern banking system is basically what defines modern capitalism. But actually, there's something within capitalism that's much more fundamental than that. Which is, again, if we go back to a simple kind of like two people living in the forest, which is a kind of silly example because humans never lived in the forest just in groups of two. We've always lived in large tribes, which ironically were very socialistic, but anyways, or communistic. But anyways, if you just kind of take a look at a tribe of people or two tribes of people of 100 people living near each other, you know, let's say they're on friendly terms, they trade with each other. Which is basically capitalism. You don't have modern banks, and you don't have modern governments, and you don't have modern economic systems and so forth. You might not even have cash or coin yet. But in this system, still, the spirit of capitalism and entrepreneurship still exists, even at its most fundamental level. At the most fundamental level, when you're a caveman living in the forest, you can be a very lazy, stupid caveman that doesn't generate a lot, or you can be a very entrepreneurial caveman where you go out there, you chop down trees, you use those trees to create lumber, you sell that, or you trade that lumber to other fellow cavemen and help them to build their shelters, and you build a big shelter for yourself because you develop a better method for cutting down this and processing this lumber. You develop a better saw. You pay somebody, some other caveman, to invent a better saw for you so that you could saw your wood better. Then you pay some other caveman to invent some rope that you can use to lash the wood together with. Then you can use those to build a boat, and you can pay some other caveman to learn how to navigate on that boat and travel up or downstream and trade with other caveman tribes up or downstream of you, and, you know, trade them for their, supplies like metal or chickens or seeds or whatever. And then you can do that, and you can build a whole fucking village. One very industrious caveman can organize and build a whole village in 20 years. Whereas another caveman could just sit around navel gazing and jerking off and living in a fucking cave. Those are the beginnings of capitalism. And once that very industrious, creative caveman, entrepreneurial caveman, starts his little village, he can leverage that village and the capital he's built, and also all the people he's helped to uplift out of poverty, let's say, he can leverage that to go and build other powerful technology, whereas the guy living in a cave jerking off all day and smoking weed, he has no capital and no resource to do anything with. And this situation is not unfair. This is precisely how it should be. This is fairness. This is perfectly fair. Speaking of demonization, there's a lot of demonization of corporations. Not seeing that corporations actually do a lot of good. Now, of course, there's the evils of corporations are so obvious that they almost don't need to be said. But a lot of what's overlooked when you're demonizing corporations is all the good that they do. Also, progressives and liberals tend to not see that corporations are like living organisms, and they actually do act like agents and like people. That doesn't mean that a corporation should have as much moral worth as a person. I'm not equating a corporation with a person, but a corporation is also not just some abstract legal entity. A corporation is something way beyond that. A corporation is like a hyperorganism, and it functions as such. And if you don't respect that, you're not going to have a good understanding of how to manage these corporations. Also realize that these corporations meet the survival needs of many employees working under them. And also, they satisfy many customers with the services that they need. So for example, you can sit around all day and shit on companies like Comcast. Comcast is one of those companies that people love to shit on because, they charge extra hidden fees on their internet service, and their internet service might not be so reliable or whatever. But the bottom line is that you still do business with Comcast because Comcast fundamentally still provides you with a really good service. Comcast, with some exceptions, for the most part, Comcast gives you a broadband internet connection that connects you to all the favorite stuff you love on the internet. Now, you might hate Comcast because they charge you too much and some hidden fees, and they do some evil stuff here and there, but fundamentally, you love the internet service that Comcast gives you. And if you had a choice between Comcast and nothing, you would pay 5 times more than you're currently paying just to get Comcast if there was no other alternative. You would gladly pay $1,000 a month for Comcast if there was no other alternative. That's the reality of it, which shows you how much value Comcast is adding to your life, even though they might be assholes in other ways. So be careful jumping on this bandwagon of groupthink that just demonizes corporations. Yes, the reality of business is that there's a lot of collateral damage that business does. In fact, it's impossible to survive without creating a trail of collateral damage. This is true of every organism, and it's true of course, of every business. Every business causes pollution, waste, and other sort of externalities. Now, we need to have better methods and laws and regulations for how to deal with these externalities. However, you have to be much more mature and adult about how these externalities work. The fact that there are always going to be some degree of externalities. You can't survive otherwise. And the way that you survive and the way that you do business also causes externalities. You have to realize that. It's not just the giant oil companies and the defense contractors that have externalities. You do too. Your business, your life. For example, if you're a YouTuber on YouTube making videos, and you might say, well, Lee, I don't have any externalities. My business doesn't have any externalities. Yes, it does. You know how many children get abused because of the internet? You're part of that whole ecosystem. As a YouTuber, for example, you create content for YouTube. That content attracts many people to YouTube. And, of course, many children. And then these children, they will get groomed, abused sexually, financially, and in many other ways through the internet. And it might have been your content that attracted those people there in the first place. Maybe you didn't personally abuse these children, but you lured them in. You were part of the ecosystem. But see, you don't take any responsibility for that. The simple reality is it's very hard to do any kind of business or invent any kind of powerful new technology without some serious externalities. As great as the internet is as a technology, there's a lot of ugly stuff on the internet that's very, very toxic and harmful. That's like an externality of the internet. That's true of almost every technology. So as long as you want to live in a society that creates new technologies all the time, and we are all addicted to new technology, new gadgets, phones, computers, games, all this kind of stuff, cars, right? All of this will come with externalities. So it's just a question of how to manage them. Don't demonize businesses for externalities. Another important point that progressives and liberals tend to make or to overlook is that they don't acknowledge that There's no such thing as rights. You don't have a right to free healthcare. You don't have a right to free shelter. You don't have a right to food. You don't have a right to exist. There is no right in the universe for existence, let alone for happiness. Now, in certain more developed countries, like in the Scandinavian countries, maybe in Canada and elsewhere, they've been developing more of this sort of idea of right. You have a right to healthcare. You have a right to shelter. You have to understand that these are, we might call these virtual rights or pseudo rights. They're not really rights. They're pseudo rights. They're invented, and they can only exist as long as our society is able to sustain it and pay for it somehow. A lot of progressives get too entitled. About things like free healthcare, shelter, food, and so forth, that these should just be standard across the board for everybody. Sort of the progressive utopia is this, you're born and you're guaranteed healthcare, you're guaranteed shelter, you're guaranteed food, you're guaranteed a stable family, you're guaranteed a good education, and you're even guaranteed university. And that kind of like sets you up, that creates the baseline. Everybody gets that. Everybody is on the same equal field. And then beyond that, if you want to work a little bit harder, or if you want to excel a little bit more, then you can earn more. But fundamentally, we all have that baseline. And that would be the just society. That's good. I like that idea personally. To me, that sounds great. But you have to ask yourself, what is it really going to take to create that? Because that ain't guaranteed anywhere in nature. Creating that required the struggle, war, genocide, and suffering and slavery of people for over 10,000 years, and we still have not reached a point where we have created that consistently in any country. That shows you how difficult that is. Now, maybe one day we can create that, and I think it's a laudable goal to work to create that, but also I'm not naive enough to think that we should already have that, or that we can create that in the next 50 years. It might take a little bit more than that. It might take more patience. In general, what I see is that progressives are not very patient when it comes to this. They act as though this should already be in place. It's like, Leo, America is the richest country in the history of the world. We should already have this. We can afford this. Maybe. How do you know? Maybe. Maybe. But maybe not. It's not so obvious. I mean, if you just do the pure math, can we technically afford it? Yes. If we restructure our entire society and we equalize and redistribute resources in radical ways, yes, we can afford it. But what you're not considering is that in the process of restructuring society to make all this affordable and work, that in that process, you're going to have to change society and business and culture and regulations and taxation in such radical ways that the majority of people are going to be so upset by this and so shocked and terrified by this that they're going to revolt against you and kick you out of office or even kill you. Because you're fucking with people's livelihoods here. You're fucking with their culture. You're fucking with their norms and standards, the way they've been taught reality works and how things should be distributed. People have an innate sense of fairness. When you go to people and you start taxing them in excessive ways or in sort of unequal ways, when one person in society is getting taxed 10%, another person in society is getting taxed 90%, this is going to create tension, animosity, hostility. You see? Now, I'm not saying that we can't change these things gradually over time, but that's gradually over time. And progressives, they generally don't like this idea of anything gradual over time. They want everything to have been already done yesterday. How about you work towards socialism and your time horizon is the next 300 years? So you're a socialist, but 300 years from now, we'll have socialism. And we're working towards it slowly. How about that? It's like, no. See, no socialist accepts that. They want it done tomorrow. But that assumes that society can change at that rate. What if it can't? What if there's a maximum rate at which culture can change? And if you go beyond that rate, you actually end up creating a self-sabotaging situation. Because the human mind needs to be reprogrammed. When you're talking about changing culture, you're talking about reprogramming people's minds. But changing someone's mind is difficult. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens over generations. Generations of people have to die of natural causes before their minds can change sufficiently enough to allow for a new type of culture, which then enables things like trans rights, gay rights, women's rights, feminism, socialism, environmentalism, and other sorts of things like this. Veganism. For you vegans, the reality for most humans on this planet is that they don't have the material luxury of being vegans. The reality for most humans is that they have to wake up every morning and go to grind and work, doing manual labor, which requires a lot of calories, which you simply can't get enough of from eating carrots and lettuce and things like this. That's not to say veganism is bad. Again, veganism has sort of a laudable goals and ideals. The compassion, the ethics of veganism, all great. But the reality, if you're just realistic, is that most humans are not materially wealthy enough to afford a vegan diet because they wouldn't have enough calories. But that's not the only factor. The other factor is the cultural factor. Most human cuisine is deeply cultural. Every part of the world has its own favorite cuisines. People have their own, recipes that have been passed down through generations for the Thanksgiving Day turkey, or for the way they make sushi, or for the way they make their Peking duck in China, or whatever. Every culture has their own cuisines. All of it has meat in it, because all of our ancestors had to survive on meat, basically. In one form or another, with a few exceptions, maybe in parts of India and so forth. But for the most part, it's all meat eaters. And so there's a lot of meat in these cultures. And so when you talk about, transitioning the world to veganism for ethical purposes and for environmental purposes, do you realize that this terrifies 90% of the population? Why is that? This is why on Fox News, they actually run fear-mongering campaigns about how the Democrats want to take away your hamburgers. And this terrifies people because you're talking about changing their culture, right? People are used to doing their 4th of July barbecue with the hamburgers. And in Texas, they're used to doing their pork rib barbecue and, those baby back ribs. And then, maybe in New York, they're used to buffalo wings. And in China, they're used to Peking duck and so forth. And here you come along and you tell them that they're all going to eat, tofu burgers. This not only terrifies people, it also pisses them off. And progressives are not very smart they're not very wise about this. They don't appreciate this. You have to appreciate that culture requires evolution. That's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about cultural evolution. If socialism will exist 300 years from now, it will exist because culture has evolved to that level. So the question you should be asking yourself is, how does culture evolve? What does it take to evolve culture? I have actually an episode, a really good episode, that's all about this. It's called How Societies Evolve. Go watch that one. It presents a lot of interesting studies and facts about the evolution of culture and the evolution of human values and human psychology. human morality evolves. Did you know that? Most people don't know that. Most progressives don't know this. One of the mistakes progressives make is they try to apply today's moral system, which is relatively high evolved, to previous generations to which it does not evolve, nor should it evolve. For example, when you are judging Thomas Jefferson or George Washington for being slave owners, you're using today's highly evolved moral system, which says that slavery is wrong, and you're applying it to 250 years ago, where that system did not exist. It's funny. I posted on my forum, or on my blog and my forum, basically, I made a post about the marvels of ancient Egyptian civilization. I said, ancient Egyptian civilization is one of the most remarkable achievements of mankind. It goes back 10,000 years. It's incredible. I posted this, and then somebody on the forum counter-posted and kind of was arguing with me and saying that, Leo, why is Leo cherishing this ancient Egyptian civilization when, weren't the pyramids built by slaves? Which actually, by the way, latest scientific research suggests, and historical research suggests, that the pyramids actually were not built by slaves. But let's say they were. Let's say they were built by slaves. Even then, it's like, by today's progressive standards, I am not even allowed to appreciate the Egyptian pyramids because they were built by slave labor. So like by today's progressive standards, like we should destroy the pyramids because slaves built them, and that's, politically incorrect and awful. It's this kind of nonsense, right? It's when progressivism goes to this level that it becomes nonsense. You have to really appreciate that the morality we have today, especially the progressive stage green value system, which is where all your morals, progressive morals are coming from, this did not exist 50 years ago and before that. It didn't exist. We had to invent it. And the only way we could invent it is by going through all the lower stages of the spiral. And we had to go through slavery, war, genocide, gas chambers, nuclear holocaust, and torture and many other evil things had to happen to get you to the point where now you could go to UC Berkeley and hang out with other people smoking weed, just chilling, eating your edible brownies, tripping balls and stuff, and talking about philosophy and talking about gay rights and talking about trans rights. None of this shit could exist 100 years ago. Appreciate that. Appreciate how difficult it was to get to this point, to develop all this stuff. Another problem with progressive politics is when progressives act like deficits don't matter and that we can just print money and spend money endlessly. I've noticed this, for example, with Sam Cedar in the Majority Report. I actually think Sam Cedar is one of the most reasonable and wisest progressive YouTube commentators. He's a little bit more older than other younger commentators. He's like in his 50s. He's more mature. He's got some very solid political takes. But one of the takes of his that I like the least is his position where he says that deficit spending doesn't matter. We can just print money because in the end, running a government, his sort of like position is that running the government budget is not the same thing as running your personal family budget, because your personal family budget, you can't print more money, but the government can print more money. And, supposedly there's some economic studies you could cite that say that, a little bit of deficit spending is actually good for government and it's actually a net positive and so forth. I really don't agree with this. I think this is problematic. Taking this kind of attitude that just because the government can print money, that means that we don't have to manage our finances very carefully, I think this is very problematic. And I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that with inflation, although, of course, there's many factors with inflation right now. It's not just the fact that we're printing money. But in general, what I don't like to see within Democrat and progressive politics is their complete dismissal of the idea that we need to be careful with our finances as a government, as a civilization. I think this is deeply problematic. That whole philosophy and attitude, it's way too liberal. I'm very sympathetic to being very conservative with money. Because I think if you aren't, it can lead into a lot of serious problems. And I think that in the future, our economy and even the dollar itself as a global reserve currency will suffer greatly for the flippant and overly liberal manner with which we treat our finances. The amount of debt that we're racking up is atrocious. And it's not Democrats who are just responsible for this. I mean, Republicans and conservatives are, of course, they're hypocrites about this, They're happy to go into crazy deficit spending when it comes to wars and when it comes to tax cuts and so forth. Personally, my preference is that we need to have a balanced budget. I would like to see a government which has a balanced budget to the point where we don't have to worry about ever going bankrupt as a country or ever defaulting on our loans. These shouldn't even be concerns, because even having these as concerns and having the inflation as a concern, even the idea that maybe next year we're going to have 10% inflation or 20% inflation, even that as a fear, even if it never comes about, just having that as a fear in people's minds is already going to destabilize the economy, create needless worries and instability. It's going to cause people to, to not invest as heavily into their businesses because you don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. What if the dollar, inflates by 20% next year? That's a huge problem. So I think there is validity to fiscal conservatism. Now, do conservatives misuse this and use it in very kind of like hypocritical ways? Yes, they do. A lot of times what conservatives will do is they will just say, in the name of fiscal conservatism, they just won't want to pass any kind of helpful policies that help a broad swath of people. They just refuse it all, altogether in the name of like fiscal conservatism. But then when it comes to allocating funds for their pet projects, they're all for it. That's hypocrisy. I think we need to be fiscally conservative across the board. And I don't really see, conservatives used to speak up for that. Not anymore. George W. Bush and Donald Trump have gone into more deficit spending than ever. If at least conservatives could be relied upon to balance the budget and to not waste money on stupid wars and stupid tax cuts and so forth, there would be a lot more sense in voting conservative. But these days, almost no conservative can be relied upon to do that. They can't even do that. That was like one of the most redeeming qualities of a conservative is like, yeah, let's say they're homophobic and they're racist and they're not very compassionate and they're assholes and they're very religious. Like, okay, we can look over all that as long as they're fiscally conservative. But it's like, they're not. They're not fiscally conservative. I think Democrats would benefit from being more fiscally conservative. Another thing that socialists need to admit to themselves is that profit motive in the private sector spurs competition and innovation, unlike government-run bureaucracies. And this is a very positive thing. So even though profit motive can be a toxic form of motivation, it can definitely go too far and become way too toxic like it has on Wall Street, for example. Still, overall, it's a good thing to have profit motive. It's better than like being stuck in some government-run organization where there is no profit motive and where ambitious people don't even want to go to work there because, ambitious people do want to experience decent profits. Maybe not obscene profits, but decent profits. Like if I'm going to work hard on my business, I want to be able to see a decent profit from that. and I want to be able to, buy myself a decent house. If I'm going to work for 10 years to build a great business and provide a lot of value to people, a lot of amazing content, at the end of those 10 years, I want to be able to buy myself a decent house. If I was working in a government bureaucracy, I couldn't expect that. And that means that the best, most ambitious, most innovative, and competitive people don't go into government. This is a problem. We actually want our government to be lean, efficient, and competitive and innovative. And so conservatives do have a legitimate point about making sure that government doesn't get too bloated. Now, conservatives go way too overboard with that, and they basically criticize any kind of expansion of government. That's a problem. The size of the government itself doesn't matter. What matters is your government responsive, effective, efficient, creative, and high quality? It's the quality of the government that is important, not its size. And to have a quality government, you need high-quality people to want to enter into the government. How are you going to get high-quality people to enter into the government when all the best rewards for creativity and innovation and ambition lie outside of government? You see, so it would be nice if we could somehow tune the government bureaucracies in such a way that they would reflect better the reward incentives of business. But we have to be very careful about that because we don't want to turn government into just people doing things purely for profit. That would also be a problem. So it's a very delicate balancing act to get that one right. But profit motive is a good motivating factor for organizing a society. We want to create our society such that people who rise towards the top of the hierarchy, if we're going to have a hierarchy, which we have to some degree, the people who are going to be towards the top, we want to make sure that those are the most intelligent, the most hardworking, the most creative people, and they are well compensated, but not to the point where it becomes so outrageously corrupt that then they can use that profit to undermine the entire system, which is what we have now with all the money and lobbying that goes on in politics. Another problem I see with progressives is not acknowledging that democratically run corporations or co-ops can be problematic and uncompetitive. So people like Richard Wolff, who's a Marxist, basically he talks about democracy at the workplace. Why can't we have more democracy at the workplace where the employees get to determine what the next project is we're going to be working on, and where the employees determine how much money everybody gets, and they get to determine how much vacation we take, and they get to determine all these things. Democracy at the workplace. In general, I like that idea. That's a good idea. But you also have to wonder, is a corporation that is structured in this way going to be as successful and competitive as the traditionally more hierarchical top-down organizations and corporations? It's not immediately obvious to me that it will be. Because like I said before, if you assume that the majority of your employees are really hardworking, intelligent, and creative, then yeah, you can create a cooperative structure with a flat hierarchy and it can work well. However, I think that's a false assumption. I think the majority of employees are actually deadbeats. They don't work really hard. They're lazy. They're not creative. They're not interested in going to work and being very passionate and ambitious. They're just there for a paycheck. That's the majority of employees. Now, I ask you, why should such employees get to have a democratic say in the big picture vision and plans for that corporation? What happens when you take those unintelligent, lazy, unambitious employees and you ask them to help formulate the vision for your company? You might say that's going to be a good thing because, those employees, that they will ask for better benefits, more pay. They will ask for more vacation time, a 4-hour work week, or a 4-day work week, and this kind of stuff. But you know what? Those employees will end up shooting themselves in the foot, because if you create a corporation like that, which gives a bunch of vacation days and a 4-day work week, and it's not very ambitious, it doesn't put a lot of pressure on people to work and innovate hard, what happens is that co-op, it'll be democratic and great for a while, but eventually it'll get outcompeted by other businesses, which are much more bloodthirsty and harder working, work twice as hard, twice as smart, because they're run by management who is very, very ambitious. Rather than a bunch of lazy employees who just want to go home and smoke weed. Another problem with progressives is not acknowledging that tax cuts are not equivalent to tax hikes. So sometimes, progressives will frame things in such a way that a tax cut, like let's say a tax cut, let's take the Trump tax cuts. Trump's tax cuts created a huge deficit in the budget. But it's a little bit unfair to characterize it that way, because tax cuts do give money back to you that you yourself generated. See, there's an asymmetry between doing a tax hike versus a tax cut. Because the tax hike is taking money away from you that you generated, whereas a tax cut gives you that money back. So these are not quite symmetrical. Even though I do believe in a progressive tax system, I think progressives are a little bit too sloppy about how they treat taxes. They treat taxes in a way where you're not quite respecting the fact that the money that you're taxing, that this is labor. Fundamentally, you're basically taxing the labor of somebody. And when you do that, you have to have a good justification for it. And then when you do a tax cut, that should be easier to justify, because you're just basically giving back the person the labor that they did for that year. It's a small, minor point, not a very big point, but anyways. Here's another one when it comes to taxes. Progressives tend to not acknowledge that tax hikes cause capital flight. And your system must be competitive with neighboring systems, because you're not going to have a monopoly on your system. So, for example, actually in the United States, there's a great real-life example of this, which is like state income taxes. Every state in the country, 50 states, has their own income tax rate. California is on the higher end. And for example, Nevada, where I live, has a 0 income tax rate. Texas, Nevada, Washington, Florida, they have 0 state income tax. The problem is that a state like California or New York, if they have high taxes, they're going to start losing people. Companies and people are going to move out of California and New York to those places where there's 0 taxes or very low taxes. And that's been happening lately. But likewise, the same situation can happen with your country. For example, if American taxes become way, way high, then you're going to see a capital flight. People will be moving out of America to live other places in the world. Companies will be started, not in America, but other places in the world. Now, I don't think we're really at a serious risk of that right now. I think we could raise our corporate taxes significantly in America, and companies would still stay here and new companies would still be founded here. But there is a limit. And every time you're going to raise the taxes by another 10%, you're going to be causing and incentivizing more and more people to move abroad or move to a different state or to start a company in a different place. And eventually that's going to, end up hurting the country. So sometimes I see that progressives aren't sensitive to this topic. But again, it's all a matter of degree. I think we can still raise taxes significantly and avoid this problem, but you do have to keep it in mind. I think that conservatives have a legitimate point in wanting to keep bureaucracy lean and efficient and to eliminate too much regulation and too much red tape. There is a legitimate function to that. Now, conservatives grossly abuse this, and they are just completely anti-regulation, or they want to eliminate important regulations. There is an important function for regulation, so I'm not anti-regulation at all. But we do need a mechanism for reevaluating regulations periodically and eliminating those regulations which become outdated or unnecessary or just make business and life too cumbersome, because that does eat into the economy and the efficiency of starting new businesses and doing certain, technologies and so forth. But we still need a lot of regulations on, pollution, on gas emissions, on oil drilling. And we need a lot of regulations, but also we need a mechanism for removing regulations too. Liberals and leftists can falter on this issue of globalization. In fact, this has been a real source of fuel for the right wing recently, in the last 10 years with Trump and so forth, is that the excessive globalization that has happened in the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years, especially in America, has led to a lot of outsourcing of jobs and manufacturing and factories and so forth, to the point where a lot of the middle class has been gutted and lost their jobs. And then this leads to a lot of destabilization of society and resentment. And honestly, it leads to a fuel and fodder for fascist movements, which is what's been happening with MAGA. So globalization cannot be taken lightly. Globalization is a force that is happening. You can't stop it. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Outsourcing is going to happen. On the other hand, there needs to also be an appreciation for the role of nationalism, national identity, and sort of a protectionism, protecting national interests. I think that liberals, leftists, progressives have been somewhat a little bit too flippant and negligent in this area. And that's why Trump's message of America first has been so appealing to many, is because sometimes what happens is that leftists kind of like take a globalist perspective to the point where they stop putting their country first. And of course, ultimately, that's a good thing. You don't want to put your country first. You want to put the whole globe first. But if you put the whole globe first ahead of your own country, what's going to happen is that the majority of your people are nationalists. The majority of your citizens are nationalistic. They're not globalists. And so what's going to happen is that eventually they're going to get so pissed off at you, they're going to think that you're betraying them, and they're going to turn on you and kick you out of office and start a nationalist government, and they're going to basically go fascist on you, which is exactly what's been happening. And part of that is because there's been some excessive globalization happening through the 90s and 2000s. Now, of course, there are progressives who are very pro-defending national interests, like, for example, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders will talk about the excesses of globalization. He will talk about the need to create manufacturing jobs at home and this kind of stuff. And that's why he's very appealing. A lot of Trump supporters actually appreciate Bernie Sanders because of that. But there are leftists who also go too far with the globalization, and fundamentally, there's a failure to appreciate the role of nationalism. Nationalism is seen as just a purely negative thing. Actually, nationalism is not a purely negative thing. Nationalism is a necessary stage of development within civilization. You have civilizations start with just tribalism, then they evolve into nationalism, then beyond nationalism, it evolves to globalism. And all those are important stages. They all need to be balanced out together. If you have globalism at the expense of nationalism, this becomes a problem. Because in the end, most of the citizens in your country have a national identity, right? And this national identity should not be taken for granted. It has to be created. Nobody is born with a national identity. And in fact, the majority of the national identities that exist today, they didn't exist a couple hundred years ago. Most nations are very modern nations. America is 300 years old. Italy is like 100 years old. Germany is like 100 or 200 years old. These countries, you think these countries have existed for thousands of years? No. What we see with Iraq, for example, just creating an Iraqi national identity, this has proven way more difficult than anybody thought. Because in Iraq, in the Middle East, these people are not evolved enough to have an Iraqi identity. What they have is they have a Sunni or a Shiite identity or a Kurdish identity or, some local little tribe that you've never even heard of. They have very tribal identities. So the way human civilizations evolve is that first you have tribal identities, then a lot of conflict and evolution has to happen in order to unify all those tribal identities into one national identity. This usually requires a lot of war and killing and raping and slavery and genocide to create a national identity, like an Iraqi identity. Then, once you get the Iraqi identity going, that's good. But the problem with that is that this nationalism can go overboard. It can turn into Nazism, basically. This is when nationalism goes too far, it turns into a sort of Nazism. But that doesn't mean nationalism is bad. It just needs to be moderated. Then you evolve past nationalism, and now you develop a world perspective. Now you start to see yourself not as an American or as an Iraqi or as a German or as a Jew. Now you see yourself as a global citizen, as a human. But just because now you see yourself as a human, that doesn't also still mean that you're not an American or an Iraqi. You still are. You still are a German. You still are a Jew too. And you have Jewish interests, or you have Israeli interests, or you have American interests. So balancing all this is very, very tricky. And as a progressive, you will tend to overlook the importance of nationalism because you'll demonize it as just fascism or Nazism. That's not technically correct. There's healthy and unhealthy forms of nationalism. Another problem I see with progressives is that they tend to generally assume that they can mandate top-down solutions to complex systemic problems, which tends to backfire. Go see my episode on systems thinking called Intro to Systems Thinking, where I talk about the trickeries of dealing with complex systems. The challenge with government and politics is that most of these systems are so fucking complicated that nobody knows the answers. We literally do not know what our economic system will be 100 years from now. We do not know what the best government system will be 100 years from now. Will it be the Chinese system, the American system, the Middle Eastern system? We don't actually know. The only way we learn this is by actually going through an evolutionary trial and error process of testing stuff out and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And a lot of times the things we think will work end up backfiring, which is exactly what happened with Marxism and with socialism and communism in the 20th century. We thought that we could re-engineer our old complex systems and economy into a Marxist Soviet-style, communist economy, and what we saw is that a lot of it backfired and ended up being even worse than capitalism. Progressives, as I said before, but I'll stress again, tend to overestimate human development and what we can realistically sustain. There's also a failure to understand why progressives lose elections. I see this common mistake amongst progressive political commentators is that they keep saying that, the majority of the citizenry is progressive because they agree with progressive policies. For example, if you go and you poll people and you ask them, Are you for or against weed legalization? They will say that they're for it. Are you for or against taxing the rich? They will say they're for it. Are you for or against some, foreign war? And they'll say, we're against it. And so in this sense, like you go down the list and, are you for or against free healthcare? And they'll say they're for it. This gives you a false perspective, though, because if you poll that way purely on policy, what you see is that, holy shit, the majority of the country is progressive. But that doesn't square with how elections are run, because the majority of the country seems progressive, but then elections, why are there so few progressives winning elections? Why didn't Bernie Sanders win the election? And then progressives will make up stories that like, oh, well, Bernie Sanders, it was stolen from him. No, it wasn't stolen from him. The reason Bernie Sanders didn't win an election, his nomination to the presidency and so forth, is simply because progressives are in the minority. But how can that be if most people are for weed legalization and free healthcare and anti-war and pro-taxing the rich? How come they're not progressives? How come most people are conservatives or moderates? Progressives don't understand this point. Because what you have to understand about people's political identifications is that it's not based on policy. See, you are a fucking policy wonk. I'm talking to you, Kyle Kulinski. You're a policy wonk. You think of politics in terms of policy. And most of us who follow politics seriously, and we're progressives, we are policy wonks, and we care about the policies. We care about tax cuts. We care about getting money out of politics. We care about, stopping corruption and stopping lobbying. We care about legalization of certain drugs and these kinds of and prison reform and this kind. Like we care about these things. 90% of people who go vote, they don't vote based on policy. They vote based on their feelings and who they identify with. And they vote based on their spiral stage of development and their moral stage of development and their ego stage of development. So it's very simple. A spiral dynamic stage blue person is going to go vote for the most spiral dynamic stage blue politician. And a spiral dynamic stage orange person is going to go vote for the most spiral dynamics looking stage orange politician. And a spiral dynamic stage green person is going to go vote for a stage green politician. That's it. It's as simple as that. And your policies don't matter. So even though if you ask policy by policy in a poll, many people will support progressive legislation, you're failing to appreciate the importance that culture plays in how people vote. So even though many people would say that, yeah, we should legalize weed and we should tax the rich, when it comes to, but who are you going to vote for? I'm a capitalist, and I'm an American. I'm a good old-fashioned American, and I want America first, and so I go and vote for Trump, even though Trump is not going to do any of these things for me. But Trump says America first, and he presents the image of loving America and being a patriot, and grilling burgers on the 4th of July and eating my barbecue ribs and driving my pickup truck. That's who I'm going to vote for. I'm going to vote for who I like, who represents my values, not my policies. And based on this, the progressives are losing. The progressives are losing the culture war. Because the progressives have some outlandish and wacky cultural ideas, and basically the progressive ideas are like a new culture that hasn't even materialized yet. Progressives are building a new culture, the culture that will exist 100 years from now. But people today are attached to today's culture and to last generation's culture. They don't care about what culture will be like 100 years from now. They're not that forward thinking. And progressives get this wrong because progressives think that everybody is as forward thinking as they are. No. People vote selfishly. They're very myopic, and they're not thinking about where should human rights be 50 years from now. No. They're just defending the culture they grew up with. It's just as simple as that. People aren't as smart as you think they are. Progressives don't appreciate that most people are simply not educated or wealthy enough to be stage green. That's it. It's just as simple as that. If you want to end racism and homophobia and fascism and transphobia, the most reliable way to do that is to shower people with a lot of money, make them economically successful, and put them through education. And I don't mean indoctrination, just educate them well. Give them the opportunity to go to a nice 4-year university and get an engineering degree or whatever. I don't mean some gender studies degree. I mean just an old school, simple degree, non-political. Educate them and give them the money to educate themselves and to want that kind of education. And then you'll see that these people become stage green. Don't badger them about being racists and not being fascists and call them names and stuff like that and argue and debate with them. Fundamentally, it's about meeting their material needs. Meet people's material needs, help them meet their material needs, and then they will naturally evolve in their morality and in their culture. They will become more multicultural. They will become more cosmopolitan. They will become more open to globalism. They will become more open to gay rights and trans rights. Progressives, because they grew up relatively privileged, speaking of privilege, progressives love to talk about recognizing your privilege, but funnily enough, progressives themselves don't appreciate the privilege of growing up in a first world democracy in an urban area with relative material wealth that allowed them to become progressives. This is a privilege. For the majority, life is brutally difficult. For many people living in the countryside, life is a lot harder. It's a lot simpler than it is for you living in an urban environment where your food is taken care of, your policing is taken care of, your fire department is taken care of, all this shit is taken care of. In the countryside, you have to do more of these things yourself. It's a lot more challenging. You got to provide your own security because there's no police around. You got to be able to put out your own fires because there's no fire department around. You got to be able to hunt. You got to be able to cook. You got to be able to just live a simple life. And it's very challenging. So a lot of progressives are out of touch with blue collar workers and rural people. And especially the way that the electoral system is structured in America, rural people, even though there's less of them, they have more power just by the structure of our system. And that's why conservatives tend to win a lot more elections in America than they really should. Because they are outnumbered by urban people. The structure of the system is such that every rural person has more of a vote than every urban person. Now, maybe we got to change that, but that's the system we have. And also, the cultural issues they care about are supremely important. You can't win over these rural people through policies. Because see, the progressive here would argue with me now and say, Leo, but you say we're out of touch with the blue collar people, and you say we're for globalization and stuff like that. But no, Leo, I'm a progressive populist. I want to help. Yeah, and as a socialist, I want to help these rural people. I want to help blue collar people. I want to make sure that those blue collar people, these rural people who are working these manual labor jobs, I want to make sure they get paid better, and that they don't get exploited by capitalists and so forth. So Leo, I'm on their side with my policies. This is where you're being stupid. Yeah, you're on their side with your policies, but you're not on their side culturally. And that's what trumps everything. It doesn't matter that your socialism promises these rural blue-collar people that they're going to have more negotiating power against their capitalist employer. That doesn't matter as long as culturally you're presenting the veneer and smell of all the LGBTQ, SJW, snowflake, vegan, hippie, weed smoking type of vibe. People are voting for you based on vibe. People are aligning with your politics based on vibe, the vibe they get from you, not what your policies will technically do for them. That's the irony of it here. You know, people wonder sometimes progressives wonder, like, how could these rural, blue-collar MAGA people vote against their interests? Because Trump comes into power and then he passes tax cuts for the rich. So don't they see that Trump is actually passing policies against their own interests? Of course, that's what Trump is doing, but these people cannot see it because they're operating based on culture and vibe. What they like about Trump is not his policies. They don't know what his policies are. They don't care. They're too dumb to care. They just feel his vibe. He presents them with that old-schooled, old-fashioned, good old red-blooded American vibe. Grilling burgers on the 4th of July while shooting your gun. That kind of vibe. Whereas someone like an Elizabeth Warren or a Bernie Sanders or whatever gives him the kind of like vibe of a pot-smoking, elitist, nagging, bitching, urban college professor vibe, talking down to them. That's it. That's as far as this goes. It doesn't matter whether Elizabeth Warren is going to actually pass some legislation that's going to earn them a little bit more money, pass a minimum wage that'll help them or something. It doesn't fucking matter. They're voting on vibe. Whether somebody likes you or not, it's based mostly on vibe and values alignment. Also, what progressives fail to appreciate is how much people fear change, growth, and evolution. Like, seriously, sit down and really think about this. People are scared to death of change, growth, and evolution. And that's why they resist, and that's why they demonize and strawman the other side. Look at our civilization. I don't just mean American government. I mean, look at the human civilization. The history of human civilization has been what? It's been the history of never-ending growth, change, and evolution, resisted all the way through. It's like we've been pulling a stubborn mule uphill, and the mule doesn't want to go, but we're pulling him with all our might. It's like progressives are pulling this fucking mule uphill, and this mule is kicking and screaming and eeing and hawing and biting. That has been the last 10,000 years of human evolution. And that's exactly what's happening today with progressives and with conservatives. So really, if you want to help society evolve and you want to do conscious politics, then you have to be a little bit wiser about how to navigate and manage this mule. This mule is not a rational creature. This mule does not have a high IQ. This mule does not fucking care what promises you make him. You could tell the mule, hey, just follow me up the hill, and up the hill there's going to be a giant basket of carrots for you. The mule can't think that far. But maybe if you take a carrot and you wiggle it in front of his face and you let him bite a piece of it, now the mule can understand that. That might be enough to get the mule to take one step forward. But then as you move one step forward, he gets scared and he gets stubborn again and he takes 2 steps backward. That's what you're dealing with here. That's what most people are like. They don't like change. They don't like growth. They don't like evolution. They don't like development. We're talking about social development. But social development requires individual development. So when you study your own challenges with your own individual development, notice how difficult it is for you, for example, to change your porn watching habits, or your junk food eating habits, or your drug taking habits, or other kinds of lazy bad habits, your weed smoking habits that you have. Notice how difficult it is for you to evolve beyond all that. Watching television, being addicted to social media, flipping through the phone nonstop, right? So you're addicted to all these things. Now, for you to become a very developed spiritual human being, you'd have to give all that up, or learn to significantly moderate all that, change your relationship to all that, change your relationship to sex, to food, to drugs, to money. But notice how difficult that is for you in your own life, how difficult it is for you to change your emotional system, right? You're depressed, you're anxious, you're angry, you have these emotional problems. How difficult it is for you to change that. Very difficult. You backslide, you have ego backlashes, you resist. You resist learning new information. You resist seeing new perspectives. So all that is happening for you personally, but then you expect society to just evolve rapidly towards your ideal, utopian fantasies of what society should be? No. Because you have to get everybody in society to come along with you for the ride, to evolve together. And that is not so easy. Okay, we're going to take a pause here. This episode has run on way too long. I thought it would go faster, but apparently I have a lot to say. So this was going to be a one-part series, but hey, now we're going to have two parts. So this is half. I still have a lot more information to say. So I guess there's a lot more wrong with the left than, well, I knew all this, but I just didn't know how long it would take to articulate it all. So anyways, there's going to be a part 2. So stick around next week for part 2, where we will finish this list off, and I'll give you a lot more examples of what's wrong with the left. Clearly, you can see that there's a lot of things wrong with the left. Remember, just because there's a lot of stuff on this list does not mean that there's not a lot of good stuff about the left. There is. And also, it does not mean that the list of all the stuff wrong with the right is not bigger than this list. It actually is. I could make a 4-part series about all the shit that's wrong with the right. But, I've actually already covered many of those topics in the past. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Stick around for part 2, and come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. Down, you can find the link on the website. Look, if you like my content and you are not following my blog, you're a fucking fool. You're missing out on so much free content that I'm putting out on my blog. I put a lot of effort and attention into my blog. Follow that. A lot of resources, a lot of videos, a lot of insights, a lot of interesting stuff. Some wacky, zany, kind of off the wall kind of stuff lately. I'm experimenting with how to express myself more freely and more authentically. So check out that. You can also find me on Instagram. I have an Instagram account where I also express myself very authentically, maybe a little too authentically in a raw manner. Check that out. You might be interested. Check out my book list. Check out the Life Purpose course. Come to the Actualized Forum. Join a community of like-minded people. We have some interesting discussions there. If you'd like, you can support me on patreon.com/actualized. And that is that. The final point I'll end on is this. I'm really disappointed with the quality of our politics. You might wonder, Leo, why do you talk about politics? It seems like has nothing to do with spirituality. Because fundamentally, to me, politics is about understanding perspectives. And that's my forte. That's my bread and butter. And that's what all of my spirituality boils down to, is the ability to see radically new perspectives and to be very, very open-minded. So one of the greatest gifts that I can teach you is how to be radically open-minded and how to see completely new perspectives in ways that you didn't think was possible. And so one of my objectives with this episode and this series is to help you to see progressivism in a new light, and also to help you to see conservatism in a new light. Because progressives do not really see conservatives. They don't really understand the conservative worldview. They're too close-minded, and vice versa. And so that's just one example of how we can use the power of epistemology and relativity And construct awareness, right, is to realize this. And then we're going to go beyond that, way beyond politics, and we're going to apply this to really deconstruct all of reality. That's what I'm most passionate about, is looking at reality in such radical ways that you can see that something like physics itself, imagine that physics, science, biology, evolution, history, imagine that these are just perspectives that you can see through and you can also see beyond. And then the question is, what is beyond those perspectives? What is beyond the human perspective? That's where things get really interesting. That's where we get into the deep spirituality that I teach. But also, I want you to see how this and that are connected together. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2 next week.